Are we live?
Yes.
It doesn't say it's recording it, so are we recording it as well?
No, we're not recording it. So,
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the panel, the Scrutiny Panel 3, Agile Scrutiny, and the subject this evening is planning transparency. I'd like to welcome the panel members as listed on the meeting papers, and I would like to welcome our guest speakers as well as our officers from Ealing Council, and I'd like to also welcome our clerks of the scrutiny panel. Has everybody got the agenda and the agenda and contents in front of them? Please shout if they haven't. If we can just start, any apologies for absence and substitutions for this evening?
none received.
None received, thank you. Any urgent matters that I should be aware of that should be raised?
None.
Thank you. Any matters to be considered in private?
None.
None, thank you. Any declarations of interest? None. Thank you. Let's check the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 19th of November 2020. If we can go for any accuracies and corrections at the same time. Has anybody got any issues they wish to raise? And then that's good, and that's a good thing. That means our clerks are doing a great job. Thank you. And let's kick off the main agenda item. The agenda item is transparency in the planning process. First of all, the head of planning will be introducing a cabinet report to the panel with Alex Jackson, who's the development and planning manager. And then we'll be discussing 3 subtopics afterwards. The first one will be engagement with the planning process by the man in the street. The second aspect will be the decision making on the councillor side, and the third will be the planning arrangements surrounding Broadway living. So if I can pass it on to David Scarfield and Alex Jackson, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll briefly introduce the report that went to Cabinet and is before scrutiny this evening. I recognise that in terms of those 3 areas, no doubt there will be much debate, so I'll keep this presentation fairly short and sharp. But the Transparency International report dates from June of last year and basically concerns local authorities and the probity and transparency in the decision-making process for planning applications and for pre-applications. It is notable that the report focused on the conduct of councillors, both in relation to planning, but also in terms of general local authority governments. Indeed, the report sets out in further detail the fact that only 10 of the out of 10 of the recommendations, only 2 touch upon the interconnectivity between planning officers and councillors. And that's why the report to Cabinet was framed in that particular context. That said, it is noted that the report is useful, reconsidering the role of members in their involvement in the planning system. And also, one of the recommendations is about the pre-application process. But again, the report doesn't identify that as a specific risk. So these connected issues of member engagement and planning, pre-planning application process were previously considered by Council in 2009, and the Code of Conduct was amended to make a stronger emphasis about the way in which members and indeed officers embark and engage on the pre-application consultation process that developers undertake with local communities, including councillors. The report, as I've mentioned, went to Cabinet and was approved on the 19th of January. The recommendations are for minor revisions to the Code of Conduct in terms of the way in which councillors advise officers of any meetings they attend with applicants or developers, and that suitable entries are made on what's known as the Register of Members' Involvement. And secondly, quite a significant change we feel in terms of transparency, at least, the proposal to change the pre-application process to enhance transparency by publishing pre-application material, i.e. pre-application submissions, at the time that a formal planning application is submitted for that particular development. Although it is noted that again, the pre-application process wasn't raised as a particular risk. And Chair, obviously you've highlighted the three areas that we're going to look at, and I will hand it back to you for taking us through there. Myself and Alex are going to give a brief presentation of our position against each of those, but I'll lead you to take that forward. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the introduction. Okay, so as highlighted, we'll be going through the three areas separately. There are three, although to a degree there is some overlap, but very distinct areas for scrutiny. First one will be engagement with the planning process by the man or woman in the street. So if David can start off with a brief summary of what the council's doing in terms of improving transparency and engagement with the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to hand over to Alex on this one, and for the second and third, I'll introduce. But Alex,
thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Alex Jackson. I'm the Development Planning Manager, and I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview on our position on this particular topic area. So I think it's fair to say that we all fully embrace engagement in the planning process, and I think that's what widely understood. I think obviously how we interpret that engagement is something that will obviously be discussed as part of this evening's deliberations. Just a little bit of background, we have an existing engagement process which was set out in our Statement of Community Involvement document, which was last updated in 2015. And this document really sets out how and when Ealing Council will engage with the community and others. And this is in the preparation of the local plan and also in the application process. It sets out quite a lot of detailed information in that document, and clearly it's subject to review and will be in the future. But one of the things I'll focus on is obviously how accessible information is that we hold in planning. A number of you'll all be very aware that we have a public access module site which holds a great deal of information in terms of applications that we receive, and it's also a vehicle for obviously receiving comments and feedback in response to those applications, and that's widely available. And together with other digital GIS systems that we have available, there's lots of information that's available to people who want to find out more about what's going on in Ealing, and in particular the planning service. I'd also want to just point out that technology is changing. We're all very aware of digital engagement platforms and artificial intelligence being developed to enable us all to do better and enable greater engagement. And actually, we are currently involved in an artificial intelligence project, and we will see where that leads us in the future, and there'll be more to follow on that. But there are things that are clearly changing, and that will only enable much better engagement. I think a topical area which we often do receive feedback on is on the information that is received as part of the application process. And I fully understand that for certain types of applications, the information that is provided is incredibly complicated, and it's very volumetric, and that can become very overwhelming for residents or interested parties to get through. And I wanted to give some assurance that we do work with applicants to try and make the information as clear as possible. And of course, a lot of the AI technology in the future may enable us all, including officers, to penetrate that information. But I can assure you that officers do read all those documents, and it's part of what we're trained to do as a planning practitioner. And also come on to, I guess, the end part of what we do. Ultimately, when we receive an application, we have to make a planning recommendation. And that ultimately ends in a report that is publicly available via the PAM access, or even via the committee pages or contained on Ealing Council website. In that, we try to make our recommendations as clear as possible. And as you can imagine, they can be quite lengthy because we're trying to capture all the relevant information in a summarized form. But I just wanted to make it clear that where there are other matters, such as Section 106s, we try to summarize obviously the heads of terms, which will ultimately be translated into a legal document, which is also publicly available. And of course, when we make decisions to refuse permission, obviously we have to set out the reasons for refusal. So we're trying to make sure that's all publicly available on the PAM access module. Turning now to just a little bit about the pre-application process. Again, that's
sorry, Alex. We talk about pre-app on the because that we'll be discussing that in a second point.
I was only going to make one very brief comment on that.
Fine.
So
I don't want to,
it does relate, so
okay.
Bear with me. So I was just going to mention on pre-app process, obviously, again, that is part of what we do. It's obviously part of the application process. It's clearly documented in the statement of community involvement. And obviously there's a joint responsibility, great responsibility on applicants to obviously engage early in the application process. And it's also at that stage where members can also take a great deal of responsibility to support residents in that part of the engagement, and of course also officers. Just coming on to the sort of the next steps, I guess. So we're all aware that the context in terms of engagement is taking a different direction, and the government is obviously increasingly attempting to deregulate the planning application process, and indeed the plan making process, through the planning white paper, which was obviously subject to one of your earlier scrutiny panel meetings. We're obviously trying to hold a line for continued engagement with residents, so hopefully you can understand our position on that. And I also wanted just to mention, obviously, the way we do our work, and in particular the way we engage with residents. We do continually review this, and when we and there's particularly in response to feedback and complaints that we might receive. And something I would probably just wanted to point out, obviously we've had to be very responsive and reactive during the current COVID situation. One of the things that we have learned through this process is obviously we need to obviously ensure consultation is as smooth as possible. That's resulted in us doubling our strategy consultation requirements, and also encouraging even more applicants to notify affected parties, and also asking communities to engage more with each other using their various digital platforms. And of course, we will have to review this as COVID, as we recover from the COVID situation. And then finally, I just thought just to mention another opportunity to be part of early engagement will be via our newly formed design review panel, which we have recently set up, and we're also in the process of setting up a community review panel, which will be later on in the spring. So that's a very good opportunity for earlier engagement. And I'll just finish on just sort of a sort of note to everyone that we shouldn't forget, obviously, that the applicant is also important in this process. We have to take on board the engagement with them. We do deal with around 5,500 applications a year, and it may not be apparent, but at least 50% of what we deal with are submitted by residents and small businesses within the borough. So we have a responsibility to obviously to them as well. So I'll just finish on that, but I'm very happy to answer any questions as we go through the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Before I just move on, there was one item I forgot to mention, because it was way down on my list to mention, is that throughout this evening, please do not refer to any live applications, because they are still to be determined. However, you can use past applications just to highlight a point that you wish to raise. Thank you. If we can now introduce and welcome a speaker, Miss Denise Colliver, who's a co-chair of Stop the Towers. Stop the Towers is a relatively new residents group who's recently come into contact with the planning process, and I hope we can get a wholesome overview on their experience. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you for inviting me to speak. I really appreciate it. I got involved initially in planning decades ago when I was part of the Ealing Chamber of Commerce. So I was aware of various development sites, including one that's literally next door to me. And I'm highlighting this because I never wanted to be seen as a NIMBY, but I was encouraged to become chair of Stop the Towers. And so I want to really reinforce that this is to represent a community perspective as opposed to somebody who's quite close to a potential development site. It's very much trying to be aware of how the community views developments both now and how the community will absorb that new development into a new community going forward. But we were invited to go to a consultation by a developer, and we were given 3 working days notice of this. But despite the short notice, a large number of local residents went along. And a number of us were quite prepared. We'd got the site-specific guidance for this site. And so we had an idea of what we could expect. And we were appalled that the proposal bore no relevance to that site-specific guidance whatsoever. And one of the things that it became very apparent was that the developer's timeline showed community consultation, but in reality, their timeline was so short, it wouldn't have allowed for any community feedback to be incorporated into their proposal, for any amendments to be made in any significant way. So there's a sense of very much within the community that this was just a tick box exercise. There was also concern that a lot of the illustrations that are used by developers are manipulated to minimize the impact, the height, the massing of their proposal by strategically placed trees or other buildings. So there's a concern that they're not playing fair right from the start, that they're trying to minimize the impact on the community. Now, it's not really easy for Joe Public to engage with planning proposals because they don't really feel that they're listened to. As I said, they don't feel they're listened to by the community consultation feedback that's given. It doesn't seem to be absorbed and incorporated or valued in any way. I believe it's actually reported within their submission, but very little value is given to it. And the public doesn't actually feel that they're listened to much by the council. Now, within the West Ealing area, a huge amount of community engagement was involved in producing the West Ealing Neighbourhood Plan, which, if I remember correctly, was actually voted upon and adopted. And yet, even then, it feels like the council doesn't adhere to some of these plans when it comes to their ongoing discussions with developers. So we got to the situation where a group of residents were really angry, and that's how Stop the Towers was formed. But at the time, none of us knew much about planning at all. And there was a whole raft of guidances ranging from national planning guidance, the London plan, the new London plan, which is now called the Intent to Publish London Plan, and of course Ealing's development DPDs and site-specific guidances, West Ealing neighbourhood plans. So it was very difficult as newbies, as Joe Public, to try and understand how this plethora of documentation and guidances fitted together. But the overall understanding is that those guidances that are there to prevent harm, not to discourage new development, and indeed none of us want to discourage new development, but it's under, you know, one gets the impression that they're there to undergird good planning practice, and yet that doesn't seem to play out in the long-term reality. So you've not only have you got the plethora of planning documentation, when it actually comes to accessing the planning portal and accessibility and transparency of the information, just accessing the portal isn't easy for everybody. The portal itself is easily swamped. We found that there was a number of times when it was overloaded and documents couldn't be downloaded, particularly after we'd sent out a mailing providing the public with information. It seemed to just crash. When it came to it, and I can only give sort of one example here, but I'm sure this is true of any larger development. We had 53 documents to download, many of which were multiple pages long. And then 2 weeks prior to the planning committee, there were another set of 22 documents that were provided with revisions that at the last minute we had to review. And none of us are planning experts. It's actually quite difficult even to comprehend and go through the officer's report. And I appreciate that the planning officers are writing the report where they're trying to be comprehensive and yet also trying to sort of give a simplified picture. So one of the things that we felt was important was it would be really good if at the start there could be a 1 to 2 page executive summary of key issues, a brief statement of the proposal produced by the case officer at the start of the public consultation, something that Joe Public can get their head round. It would be really good if the developer had to portray images that are accurate. And in order to get active engagement with the local residents groups, it would be really good if the council could facilitate this. Now, as an example, the Percival House, no, I'm not allowed to use the current one.
No,
okay,
please.
There are many instances where only 1 or 2 residents groups are contacted and not in a slightly wider area. As an example, the development on Rome and Castle House, the old BT building on Gordon Road. Nobody in the Five Roads area was informed about it, even though the Five Roads area is on the other side of the railway tracks. So that just gives you an example, if you like, of how parochial, how limited some of the council approach or the developer approach is to the public consultation. I appreciate I need to get to the point, but we also would like to for the council to ensure that the list of residents groups is complete and kept up to date. For a long time, the Five Roads contact person listed on the council website was totally out of date, despite the current chair repeatedly asking for it to be revised. And so it's important that the council and the developers try not to use jargon. It's important that they sort of have a good exercise in public communications, and that the communications are digestible. And we would ask, when is the council going to actually comply with its own housing policy, rather than allowing what seems to be, from the public's perspective, a lot of policy to be ignored in order to get more homes built, often high-rise ones.
Thank you. Thank you, Denise. Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to now turn to the panel. If the panel have any questions to either Alex Jackson on behalf of the council, or Denise Colliver on behalf of a residents group. Hands up. Councillor Bull.
Thank you. Yeah. So a few kind of unrelated points and questions that came to my mind. I think the first thing is that it's really, Ealing doesn't do this well, but it's really hard to see how it could be done well. The issue of getting meaningful residents engagement with the local development plan process. Each time we go through the process, there's a really small number of residents respond. From a few residents groups that are following the planning process very closely. Although thousands and thousands of people in the borough are very interested in issues to do with what our borough should look like, there is almost no engagement with the vast majority of them, and it's really tricky because the engagement is done as, give us your comments on this 300-page document. So that's something to, as I said, I don't think there's a simple answer, but that's certainly something we ought to look at. The information on the applications portal, the PAM portal, often the basic information about I think there's an important dates section that's supposed to tell you when a decision is going to be made. That's often not correct. So it's really tricky for residents that are trying to find out what the status of, when's it going to be decided? Is it going to committee, or is it going to be decided by officers? When's the decision going to be made? That's really very often wrong in my experience.
Do you have any questions? Sorry, John, do you have any questions?
An actual question. So Alex mentioned about the planning notification letters being doubled. So we could have a bit more information about what's happening there in terms of what the current notification rules are, because of course the old letter process were removed altogether, and then we're relying on lampposts, and a lot of people aren't going out and seeing the lampposts. So it'd be very helpful to know what the current situation is now in COVID, because I'm not clear. And then the other final question is arising out of something that Denise said. Would it be possible to have a process where we require developers to give views of a proposed major development from particular vantage points that are selected by the residents? Because at the moment we've got the situation where the residents come up, the developers come up with, as Denise says, applications from cunningly chosen points so that a tree hides it or something, and then residents sometimes have done their own versions of it, but when it comes to the planning meeting, the officers say, well, that's not an official thing, so we can't verify that's accurate. So would it be possible to have a requirement for the developers on their CAD system to come up with things from specific vantage points?
Okay, so John's now uncovered a few sort of sides. If maybe Alex or David can maybe cover the improving the engagement on the neighbourhood plans and local plans, and the admin of the data corrections and the image issue, and I'll come on to next councillors afterwards.
Yeah, I'll pass over to Alex to give some feedback on the details there, but we do recognise, obviously, and Alex has said this, that part of our role is to embrace engagement. It's not something that we just do because we're duty bound to do it. We recognise that it's a fundamental part of the whole planning process, and we also recognise that as Denise has said, that the majority of people that are engaging with us, either as applicants or in terms of commenting on a planning application, will perhaps be the only time in their lives that they are doing this. So we deal with not only communities of place, local areas such as West Ealing, but also communities of interest that ebb and flow as time goes along. So we try and maintain a consistent approach with all of those communities across the borough, and also with the applicants and the developers. And we're continually looking at how we engage and responding to the issues that individuals and community groups have when they raise them with us. In terms of the local plan, you know, it is and it always will be, I think, one of the big issues is getting people to engage with planning policy and the local plan review process at that strategic early stage, because it's at that stage that both officers and councillors and residents of the borough can actually fundamentally shape what's going to happen over the next 10 or 15 years. And it's been difficult in the past, and I think it will be difficult. But one of the things that we now are actively looking at, and we're out to procure it, is the use of digital engagement technology. And that's a move away from the old style of having meetings in buildings and doing things from desktop studies, to using some of this technology that is out there to give us digital platforms that we can ask people in local areas almost for real-time comments, not only on local plan, but we can extend this to planning applications at some stage in the future. So that's a really important step, Mark. We're not doing away with the way we've done things in the past, albeit at the moment, because of COVID and restrictions, we cannot meet in person. But we are going to enhance that through digital engagement. But we are happy to talk to residents groups, and anybody as these concerns continue to be raised. I just want to hand over to Alex now on some of those details. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Yes, just in answer to the question around the consultation periods, at the beginning of COVID last year, we essentially doubled our statutory consultation process. So the traditional 3 weeks, which is the legislative framework for consultation, was doubled to 6 weeks. We've continued with that throughout this time, and for now we're continuing with that as well. Obviously, it does mean that application assessments will take longer to deal with, but that's what we have elected to do, and we are still doing that by site notice. What I alluded to in my mini presentation was that we have also been asking applicants to also engage and notify people who are affected by this, and also write back to us to confirm what they've done, whether it's by leaflet drop or by email if they have different contact details more than we would actually have. And that seems to be an acceptable way that people want to notify people. So those sorts of practices we would hope to be taking forward in the future. And I know you have another attendee tonight who might want to speak about how that works in practice. But my impression from applicants and residents is that applicants are not opposed to doing that. Absolutely not. They want to make things as straightforward as possible. There's no intention not to engage with people, and obviously, we need to make it as easy as possible. And just coming back on verified views and what to look out for in terms of viewpoints. When we do have occasion to obviously look at extensive verified views, we will choose, hundreds, and of course we will also home in on the most significant ones. Now, I appreciate, and I can assure you that there will be occasions where images that come back look quite contrived because of the presence of trees or lampposts, and we do challenge that. And one thing that we are looking to do quite quickly in the future is to look at that as a sort of training opportunity for everyone as well, so that that could be offered to members as well, as perhaps some community groups, to see what that what to spot. But generally the ones that you will the committee members will have seen or in submissions have been prepared by consultant. They are verified views. They do have to be tested, and we do need to take those into consideration. And I appreciate that some residents will obviously submit alternative proposals, but they may be taken from different perspectives, and obviously plotting mass building masses might be quite different. So in terms of being choosing images, that can come as part of early pre-application involvement, and obviously involving groups that we do know about, and obviously groups do form and fall away as well. So I take your point of obviously making sure that our records in terms of who are active groups is constantly up to date. And that is a responsibility for us to do, but also for residents to let us know that what their area of interest is and who the up-to-date contacts are. So we'll obviously ensure to keep our records up to date on that. Hopefully that answers those 2 points, Councillor Ball.
There was one other one, which was just the dates on the PAM system, particularly for smaller schemes, are often wrong. Okay,
that is very evident at the moment because of the extended consultation. So obviously when an application is validated, it calculates the statutory date to be determined. Now, if an agreed extension of time is made, that should also be available on the PAM on the public access module. Obviously, for some other applications, the date in which a decision will be made may change or may not be known. So that's why that information isn't available. But we will see what we can do to make sure that the dates are more readily available, and also to make sure that there's an understanding of when a decision will be made. But the majority of our applications, which can be viewed on the public access module, will have an end date. But there will be exceptions on more complicated schemes.
I agree, Councillor Ball. Sometimes the dates are back to front, and sometimes the determination date is before the end of the consultation date. So it's a bit of double checking, I think, a bit verification, human eye. Thank you. I don't know who was first, so I'll go in order of who's raised their hands. It's Councillor Woodruff. Simon? There you are.
Trouble with the unmute button. Yeah, actually, Alex has answered most of what I was going to ask about the pictures, because I mean, as a councillor, if you're on the planning committee, actually the first thing you often know about any application is when the agenda arrives, and sometimes, and so you see the pictures and you might see it in on the day in the presentation, and they are obviously quite effective if somebody's got a picture of it. So I'm always keen to know how accurate they are. I mean, do we afterwards, in retrospect, go around some of these places and compare them to the pictures to see whether they were indeed accurate or not, or do we just have to wait for somebody to complain about it? Because I think that would be quite
sometimes. I do sometimes do check what's been built. So you don't have any questions? Okay, Councillor Taylor.
Well, I just want to know whether we do go around afterwards to sort of.
Okay, I'll take that together. Councillor Taylor.
Okay, thanks, Chairman. Yeah, I've got a number of questions if I can. First, around the role of members in that process. I'm sure Alex and David are aware. I mean, I represent East Acton and obviously North Acton, which had a high volume of applications, and I wondered whether officers were tracking applications in areas, whether it's my area or perhaps Southall, there's a high number of applications, because I must admit, myself and my colleagues were overwhelmed.
Councillor Taylor, I'm not sure if it's my end or your end. The sound keeps disappearing.
All right, Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. And also, just to highlight, are we talking about the committee side of things or the contact of the planning process with Joe Public?
The latter, but also in terms of members' roles.
Okay, the members is the next section. Okay.
Okay, I'll save that bit then. All right. Yeah.
Okay. Decision making.
Okay. All right. Just on the resident side, then, I wondered when Denise was talking on two levels, because I know I got inundated around with information around Stop the Towers. Now, I'm not on planning committee, so and it wasn't something in my ward, and I wonder if residents actually understood the role of all councillors in that context, and also are they fully up to speed with the idea of planning is quasi-judicial and it doesn't operate on a party political basis?
Denise? Sorry, actually, I've got the. Can I ask Councillor Burke as well if she has any questions for clarification, and then we can bring it all together.
Yes, so quite a few questions really. So for me, the issue is that consultation has to be meaningful. So my questions relate to the fact that I actually do think people engage a lot. In my ward, they've engaged an awful lot. But one of the challenges that I found is that there has been no response to their engagement. So my questions relate to that, and I still feel quite new to this as a councillor, the transparency. So number one is that if you get 2 or 3 people objecting to a decent sized development, there seems to be no difference in response from the council officers than if it's thousands of people. So I don't understand the weighting of that. And secondly, in my experience of dealing with the planning committee and in dealing with officers, I don't understand and would welcome clarity on when the local plan, and the Towers one in Manor Road was a very good example of this, and the London plan were overridden. And actually, in terms of the officer's response, it actually said that we are overriding the fact it's not central Ealing and the fact that shared ownership is a bit iffy here and so on and so forth. So again, my question is, from the public point of view, they've gone to a lot of bother, got lawyers involved, etc., 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 to say these are things and yet the officers just say, well, we're ignoring that because we think it's a good development. So I don't understand the transparency of how that decision is made, that we're going to ignore our own plan and the London plan. The third thing I don't understand, or would welcome clarity on, is how we make a decision that on character. So apparently character is a legitimate planning objection, but I've asked over and over again for how do we weight that? So again, in terms of the officer thing, and I'll use that Manor Road one, the officer thing was very strongly pro that, but the character thing was never addressed. It was actually by the councillors when it came to the decision, but from the officer perspective, it was actually, well, that it, you know, there's no debate that it doesn't fit with the character. But
Councillor Burke, if I may just put those points into the second section of this evening, okay?
Because this is just to say, Joanna, just from the point of view, if I, as a member of the public engagement will all be about if they think it's meaningful. And if they are doing things and then not getting a transparent response to it, just that we're not taking any notice of this.
So if a proposal is in line with the plan, you mean the proposal stage?
At the proposal stage,
Okay.
people are putting it in and saying, these in the London plan or the local plan, this doesn't meet it. And the response is, well, we agree, but we're just choosing to ignore that. We will never get meaningful local engagement. Similarly, with the early stage of the design review panel, I've read a lot about that, and we are supposed to take notice of it, but we don't take any notice of it. So I've yet to see where one of the public, very legitimate and well-researched objections has actually been taken any notice of. And that's what I struggle with. And if I, as a, from the member of the public perspective, and I don't know if this is relevant now, Joanna, or to later on, but equally, and this may be a legal thing, the public are given so little time to talk at the actual meeting. So they get
We'll
about
do that in committee.
Okay,
That's the committee. Okay, so if I can direct a few questions to the officers and a question to the speaker. So to the speaker, do residents, so this is Councillor Taylor's question, do residents understand that it requires a planning committee where there's no political influence? How does the public see that? Is that correct, Councillor Taylor?
Yeah, there was two elements to that, just to be clear. One is the role of all members, all councillors. Using your campaign as an example, I got inundated with emails, information, but it wasn't relevant to me because I'm not on planning committee. It wasn't my ward, so I wasn't going to respond. From a tactical campaigning point of view, it seemed pointless. But secondly, understand the role of councillors. I know political parties make hay of it, but it is a quasi-judicial role. Planning members do make the decisions based on the merits of an application in front of them. And I just want to know if that's widely understood.
You'd like me to reply to that?
Yeah, yes, please.
I think that a lot of people within Stop the Towers, certainly the committee, and a number of our supporters understood that some of the councillors we were encouraging people to contact weren't actually attached by area. However, it's also widely understood that Ealing Council is a Labour-held seat, a Labour-held council, and we assume that as colleagues you talk to each other. So we can address a planning application in two ways. We can prepare a really good submission detailing all the legitimate material planning reasons why something shouldn't be given approval. But as somebody else, can't remember who it was, identified that it was Linda identified, quite often despite that, planning approval will go through. So there was a sense of needing to apply political pressure, and that had to be across the board to all of the councillors, both red, blue and Lib Dems, in the sense that hopefully as colleagues working together, you would say, well, I've had a whole load of people say this about this. What's your justification for it? Because how else can we exert our community response?
If I may just jump in there, the councillors on the planning committee are what's the word? I won't say restricted. Have a code of conduct, which David Scarfield mentioned earlier. We have a code of conduct on how planning committee members are supposed to act, including not having a predetermined view on an application. And if whether it's a member of the public or anybody sees as being different, then obviously that's a separate legal issue that we need to raise separately outside of the planning process. It's actually a legal matter, and the code of conduct matter standards. So we have to be very clear that that those councillors anywhere in this country which act beyond that code of conduct will be dealt with separately. So we have to assume that every planning committee member comes into planning committee with an open mind. So
one would love to assume that that was the case, and all I can say is, looking back at some of the planning decisions, I find it fascinating how the councillors within a ward where there's a large...
Denise, I just have to be very careful here. If there is some, you have to just be really careful. If there's any chance of any allegation against a situation, then we have to take it seriously outside of this meeting. This is not, I suppose, the scope for the legal, because this is a serious matter that we're discussing here. You have to be very careful.
I understand where you're coming from. So all I can speak of as a member of the public, one gets a feeling that things tend to go through very easily, put it that way, despite the plethora of material planning reasons which would cause harm to the community. Things get approved. And it feels that the public is disempowered and not listened to.
Okay,
so that's my response.
No, that's fine. No, thank you for the input, but I'm just have to be really careful here for your sake, as well as any future or even past planning committee members, especially in controversial applications. And David, Alex?
Yeah, Chair, thank you. Quite a bit there. I guess one of the words that I wrote down was expectation, and perhaps that's something that we need to look at in terms of not so much members, and we'll come on to that, but certainly managing the expectations of residents and community groups in terms of their role in the planning process, but also how we take account of the representations that we make. So firstly, as officers, I think Councillor Burke used the word ignore, which to be fair is something that we hear quite a lot. But there's a difference between disregarding, i.e. not taking into account, and taking into account and then considering it against the balance of the planning application. So I would want to reassure everybody that all the replies that we receive are considered and are read, and indeed we rely on those to some extent to give us information that the case officers won't be au fait with. You know, you as local residents are the people that know that area and know that site as well as anybody. But when it comes down to the actual decision, the decisions must be made in relation to the local plan, and I'll come back to that, and to other material considerations. And the material considerations include any comments received. So we're statutory bound to take those into account, and we do, but there's a balance to be achieved. And in some cases, as you will know, on small and large planning applications, the consideration of the case officer and his or her superiors is that there's no reason to refuse the planning permission. And the case law is also quite clear that regardless of the size of objection, there must be a material planning reason to actually refuse the planning application. So I think it was Councillor Burke that was mentioning whether it was 3 or 3,000. It's hard to say that doesn't matter, because it does in terms of like the process of looking at that. But if all of those objections were raising things that were either not planning, material planning considerations, or issues that we thought didn't warrant the refusal of planning permission, then we could still go ahead and approve the planning application under delegated, or if it went to planning committee. Now, planning committee, made up of the 13 members, is a different matter, because although they're bound by the same rules, they are a different quasi-judicial decision-making body. So members may look at those figures in terms of high levels of neighbour objections and possibly be swayed about them, but again, where refusals occur, they're based on planning reasons, and you know, you only have to go back less than 12 months ago, I think, to the Wilton development, where officers were recommending there was a wealth of community objection and it was refused. So it does work from that point of view. And also, let's not forget that under officers' delegated power, which we deal with 99% of the applications, there is a large body, somewhere between 15 and 20% of those applications, that we refuse. Some of them don't have objections and some of them do have objections. But it's simply not the case that we allow everything to go through. There are cases where obviously it doesn't comply. Just very briefly, I can fully understand why members of the community would be minded to say, well, look, you know, here's a whole suite of planning policy in different formats. Officers are not taking account of those. We have to give those documents certain weight, depending on how old they are, but we've also got to relay them and relate them to the individual development. So I don't want to seem like I'm copying out on answering that, but it very much is about the individual development and what relationship that has to the local area and to the local plan as well. So it's not simple by any stretch. And I'll leave it there because I could talk for ages on that.
Thank you. Just a question from Councillor Woodruff was, do we revisit built, sort of post-application built entities to see if it matches? David, Alex?
I can come back on that. I mean, I think it's been discussed with members previously, and we would hope that we can do that, obviously, when we're able to revisit sites again and obviously compare to the CGIs. But yeah, certainly it's something that is standard practice to review the success of the schemes as the decision was made against what is built. So yeah, I think it's a really good idea.
Joanna, do you mind if I just come back? Because there's a point of clarification on what David said. I don't know, David, that you entirely answered my question about where, and I'll use the Manor Road one, there were significant differences from the local plan, as was in draft, and from the London plan. You know, and I mean, we were lucky, we had James, who was very clear about where the differences were from the London plan. And yet, all those things were just, from the officer point of view, negated with no real clear reason. And the second thing I'd be curious to know is, in terms of large developments, what is the percentage of those that officers have not recommended that have gone through? I understand on the small ones, but on large developments over the last 2 years, for example, what percentage of those have officers said no to?
Okay, let me come back to the policy point first, and it is difficult. I mean, but one of the points that you raised there was the information, or the way in which officers consider and present that information, and that's something that we can certainly make sure that we're improving on, and it's something that we look at all the time. Is what is the substance within an officer report, particularly to planning committee, that would override any particular planning policy. But going back to planning policy in a nutshell, as I said, it really does depend on the site circumstances, and not every policy is going to be complied with. What we have to weigh is how far the scheme diverges from that, and then whether there are any material reasons why a conflict with policy would still mean that we're going to recommend or grant planning permission. It's something that we could take a full 2 hours up on talking about, and certainly when we come on to the planning committee, I'll be explaining that we do talk about such subjects in our member training quite frequently, and probably at least once a year. But I'm quite happy to come back to you or to a group of councillors, or indeed to residents, and we can talk through that in a bit more detail.
Thank you. If I may, I just ask a question for clarity. Well, I suppose not clarity, but one point of action that is being mentioned in planning user groups over the years, so it's not a recent issue, is that why doesn't the council, unlike other councils, allow or fix the automated generated reports to councillors, to ward councillors, and to residents groups and individuals, public, to receive weekly lists of applications in a specified area. That, for example, in my ward, or if a member of the public, like for example Denise, would like to know what applications are in a sort of half a mile of her postcode, with a different hat on, let's say as an individual, but as in a Stop the Towers hat. It's an ongoing issue, so I would like to ask, why hasn't that been resolved?
Alex, do you want to? I can come back, but Alex, do you want to reply?
Yeah.
On that?
Obviously, it's something that we would like to fix, and hopefully we can. We've just had a system upgrade, which will enable us to do more things, and it will be it's still on our list of actions that we want to achieve, but we do obviously provide that information, but it is something you have to extract from our public access module at the moment. So once we've bedded in the new back office system, which has been upgraded, then we'll see what we can do as an improvement. That's all I can say on that.
Okay,
I know it's been
thank you.
raised a number of times.
And just Councillor Burke's question about how many large developments which were not recommended for approval were refused. David.
I obviously haven't got the figures to hand on those. We deal with in the region of 60 to 70 what we call major applications, and if you're looking at the residential, that's anything over 10 units. So we can dig out some figures. I wouldn't say the refusal rate is going to be particularly high on that. I mean, we are an authority that wants to get development on the ground, particularly housing, not at all costs. But you know, we do approach development proposals not with the mindset of this isn't going to happen, but how can we get it to a state, working with the local community, that it would warrant an approval. So we can come back with the precise details on that.
Yes, if you can come back with some statistics and not just the refusals, just a wholesome breakdown of decisions. Thank you. And Councillor Taylor had a quick question for clarification.
David's kind of just answered it to some extent at his last point. I was going to ask, I mean, does the phrase presumption development still apply?
David?
I missed the end of that.
Does the presumption of development still apply?
It's not actually used in that format. I think the gist of the government's approach, and this is across both planning policy and the way government is seeking to reform, is indeed to be positive, I would say, towards development. So that's it differs. That approach differs from council to council. I think the majority of London councils would take a positive, open stance towards development. That's at any level. But as I say, it's not at all costs. I mean, it's simply not the case that everything that comes through the door is approved by any means.
Thank you, David. Now, if we can now open up to the panel in terms of debate and discussion. Can I see your hands up? I can see Councillor Berg and Councillor Woodruff. Are they old hands? I'm not sure if they're old hands.
No, mine's a current hand. Yeah.
Okay, so Councillor Woodruff, please.
Okay, well, first of all, I think, yeah, I mean, we're lots of members of the Labour group on the planning committee, but I think you'll find that we all spend quite a lot of time avoiding discussing planning issues in advance. I think we're all very keen on that. We're aware the penalties involved if you don't. I've been on and off the planning committee since the mid-90s, and I think people are very keen on not discussing it. Quite often there has been maybe the actual members of the planning committee have had maybe discussed it just before the meeting, but there's never been any occasion when some sort of whip has been involved, or somebody has said this is the way we're going to vote. That's actually not the way things happen at all, and I've always assumed that happens with the other groups as well. My thing about the councils, and we seem to have got onto the council's involvement, but the towers thing was quite interesting from my point of view. I mean, I was on the planning committee. There was a chance that I might be on the meeting, but I didn't know whether I would or not. We don't attend all planning committee meetings, but I got absolutely, like all of us, we got absolutely deluged with stuff from all sorts of people. I didn't know whether I was going to be involved in the meeting at all. Really, the first I knew about it was when people started sending me emails about it. And a lot of it was extremely offensive. I think there's an assumption that, oh, the councillor, you're never going to approve this. All the councillors must be in favour. There was an assumption that I was definitely going to vote for it. And the actual language people use and the way people do it, I find made me quite angry when I read a lot of it, and I think quite a lot of councillors had that as well. So I think there is a misunderstanding. I mean, we as councillors on the planning committee, we actually wait. I mean, I'd never make any decision on it until I've first of all had a look at the report, and the report comes out a week before the actual committee, and we generally don't make these sort of decisions about it. And certainly, well, I ended up voting against it on the actual meeting, but I didn't know which way I was going to vote for it a week before. I need to read the report, not just the opposition. And I found, well, I found public engagement. I was quite disheartened by the way the public were behaving on that one. I mean, that's an exceptional thing, but I think we do try and act in indeed a quasi-judicial role. We try and take the arguments on board, and it's not an election or anything. I think we look at the arguments, and I think the point is, if 1,000 people respond and 3 people on the other side, but the 3 that are right, then it's the actual strength of the arguments that really counts. And I think we do actually take that very seriously, and I'm not sure that the public realise it.
Thank you, Simon. Councillor Ball.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with quite a bit of what Simon said. Actually, it's very, very welcome to receive representations from residents, but sometimes the tone of them assumes that we are all in favour of every contentious application, and we've already decided our position, and we've decided that we're in favour of it, and they're trying to argue with us to change our minds, and that's not. I think it probably would be more likely to succeed if it was on the basis that we are the people who are going to make the decisions, and they're putting evidence to us on one side to try to sway us. So just a tone thing that probably help. But what I actually put my hand up for wasn't related to that. It was, yeah, I think there's an issue with in terms of communication between planning and the general public. There is the problem of actually being able to communicate with planning officers over planning applications. So, it's not possible for members of the public to phone them up. Quite often, there aren't replies to emails. It affects, as well as affecting objectors, it also affects applicants making householder applications, or even agents for small applications. I mean, we'll talk about the situation for large applicants later on, but in terms of the small, I mean, for instance, I've had a couple of conversations with agents who work for lots of small application for the applicants in a lot of small applications who say to me, that Ealing is the worst borough that they deal with. You know, they do applications all over London, and the one where it's hardest to communicate with the planning officers about an application is Ealing. So obviously residents don't have that perspective because they only deal with one borough. But I think it's interesting that perspective. That I think there is work that needs to be done to try to make it easier to have, you know, meaningful dialogue with the Ealing planning officers. And obviously I understand the issue that it costs money, because if you have planning officers spending time talking with people, then you need more planning officers to churn through a particular number of applications. But I think there is a big and long-standing problem with that.
Thank you. Councillor Burke.
So a little bit of what I've said in the questioning, really. I think one of the reasons why residents may get frustrated, or why they've told me they get frustrated, is because there is a perceived lack of transparency about why what appear to be good, legitimate planning reasons for something not to happen are then overridden. And I'm not talking about the planning committee making that, I mean by the officers' recommendations. So I think some of it, as David has said, may be about presentation, but I think my perception is that some of that is about consistency. And some of the perception I understand, because David, I appreciate you couldn't answer my question, but my question really is, how often do officers recommend on the basis of planning reasons that large developments don't happen? And the perception out there is virtually never. So, and you know, sometimes there are good planning reasons about light and size of development, and I've literally read things whereby the mayor's office has said, you know, these look too small, and yet our officers have said, yeah, it's fine, you know, it can go through. So that's where I think we are struggling, because on the legitimate planning reasons, not I don't want it next door to me, or I don't want the construction noise or whatever, on the legitimate planning reasons, it really isn't clear to residents who have spent a lot of time getting engaged and often spent money on this, why their good planning reasons have been ignored. And I do think we're very, very slow on our design review panel work. And my, you know, from asking around other councillor colleagues, the engagement there has been much quicker and much more meaningful in terms of them being taken notice of. So I understand the perception and the frustration. It doesn't, you know, give an excuse for people being rude, but that perception is to do with the lack of transparency about how decisions are made.
Thank you. Before I go into Councillor Taylor, I just want to prompt the panel members to start thinking about maybe a couple of recommendations from this section. I've got a few notes down, which I'll reiterate afterwards. Councillor Taylor. Can't hear you, sorry. Hitesh. Closer, I think you have to speak closer.
Eating this thing next.
No.
Well, I don't know. I'll come.
That's better. That's better.
Okay.
No, we've lost you again.
I'll come back.
Okay. If I may, before we discuss any recommendations, I've got maybe a few points to raise for discussion. There was a recent planning advisory service, which is part of the LGA. They stated that non-digital methods of consultation still matter. What are the panel's feelings on that front? I totally appreciate we've got to embrace technology, AI, totally, you know, we have to go forward, but non-digital consultations still matter. So I'd like to put that to the panel. And also, one that crosses two of our subjects this evening is that those who don't have internet and don't have access, I noticed that postal representations or by hand don't get uploaded until after the application has been determined. That's in my experience. That's the complaints I have, and I've seen they appear later. So what do the panel think on that front? Councillor Burke. Oh, is Councillor Burke, is that a new hand? Councillor Burke?
It's not. No, sorry. I'll take it back.
Councillor Ball.
Well, yeah, just on the point that you asked about, I mean, would it be possible for to require applicants to notify by post, you know, at least a small radius around applications? I mean, obviously I heard what was said earlier about encouraging them to go beyond site notices, but and I know that the council doesn't send out the letters for cost reasons nowadays, but is there any way that we could require the applicants to do that?
Okay, I'll take that on board, because any recommendations, like for example what Councillor Balls just mentioned about, you know, can we enlarge the consultation side of things. Any recommendation can go both to the council as a local planning authority, but also to the Secretary of State for national policy. So I can take note of that to look into, whilst not everyone is connected to the internet for the duration. Okay, any other hands? I can't see any hands. So no, sorry, Denise, this is about the discussion for panel members. Thank you. I just want to highlight a few points which might be recommendations from the debate and the questions. One is about although it has been discussed and answered, I think it needs to be sort of reiterated for actioning, are the dates on the portal. So this is to Ealing Council officers to make sure that the dates are correct. I think there needs to be a verification. It just causes further questions afterwards. Also, with regards to the one thing we haven't discussed is how developers or applicants send out applications to residents and they put out their own consultation, and then the application comes in, let's say 6 months later or whatever period later, and residents say, well, I've already put in my objection, for example. I would like to recommend, and this is that's generated from this evening, is possibly to seek that applicants put on their, I suppose, informal non-council applications a disclaimer saying this is not a council consultation, because those objections or positive comments for that matter are not relayed to the council. So I think that'd be a good idea personally. What was raised by Denise Colliver was that application to have an executive summary offered as part of the applications. Now, I know some information is already on their planning applications, but I think we can maybe formulate a recommendation so that the summary is less jargonized, if that makes sense, I think, for the average person, because maybe panel members may understand some planning terms, and I think that it might need to be a bit clear. Another point that's been raised, I think, across both Denise and some panel members, it's about, and Alex has touched upon it, residents associations, in terms of making sure there should be a review, I don't know, annually, possibly, maybe go through around Ealing to ensure that even new associations that have popped up are aware of this facility that the council has, of this database, because it's a bit difficult if you don't know that this list exists. Okay, so if panel members, if you can maybe agree or put forward recommendations for the pre-decision making timeline for the first point on the agenda. Councillor Ball.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything you said. The other two things that I would add would be, yeah, whether there can be a process by which the planning officers engage with kind of, the lead residents, the lead objectors, in terms of which views go into the presentation at planning committee. So initially I was suggesting going to the developers to get them to do it, but actually from what Alex was saying, if there's 100 views submitted, it may be more of a question of just, choosing some of those views which are, some of those views which the objectors would like to be shown, sort of thing. And then the other one was on the issue about whether it's possible to require planning notification letters to be sent by applicants. Is that, I don't know whether that would require primary legislation. You mentioned the Secretary of State, so maybe that would require legislation. I don't know, but anyway, if we could either raise that to officers or to the Secretary of State as appropriate.
Okay, I'll formulate a one for this sort of. Can you just reiterate your first point, please? Sorry, the first point that you mentioned.
It's about views, yes. Yeah. So it's about the CGI views of application, the images. That's right. So having a dialogue on major. We're talking about major applications, not small ones. Yeah. On the major applications, having a dialogue between essentially the lead objector who's booked to speak at planning, and the officer who's going to present to say, well, here are these. What particular views do you think are relevant to go in the presentation
or needed?
Right. So to add in, I'm not saying to replace, but so you'd have the ones that the officers thinks are useful, but you'd also have some that the objector.
Okay, so that recommendation sort of goes into the second section as well. So it goes both. Okay, thank you. So I have marked them. Councillor Burke, new hand?
Yes, please. Yeah. Is there anything that can go into this about the design review panel or whatever group exists having a fairer share of the officer's time compared to the developer in the pre-planning time? Because again, this may be a perception and not accurate, so forgive me if it is, but at the moment there's a perception that the developers can meet with the planning officers lots and lots of times, whereas the design review panel might have a meeting or two. So I get it can't be equal time, but I would find it very difficult to find that you're not swayed one way or the other, to make it more of a fair share to actually be involved in the discussion. So as the developers come up with well, let's do this, the design review panel can go back and say, well, how about that? So it's much more of a dialogue with the officers.
So taking from what you just said there and trying to formulate a recommendation, I think, as you say, it's for the large developments. Purely for the large, it's not for the loft conversion. I think it goes hand in hand also with the conservation panel, the conservation area panel. I think it's very sort of equal in terms of engagement if something is acceptable, especially if we don't have any a conservation officer anymore. Would the panel agree for a recommendation along the lines of that the design review panel and say the conservation panels to be contacted officially and have that dialogue for the large applications only? Obviously, if they don't wish to have that dialogue, then that's up to them, but the opportunity has to be given. Councillor Taylor.
Sorry.
The planning officers and the panels, the design review panel.
Okay, that's fine. Sorry, can you hear me? Can you still hear me?
I heard you really quietly, but I was really straining my ears.
Sorry. Try again. Can you hear me now?
Barely. Do you want to put in the chat what you want to say?
Yeah, sure.
And I'll read it out. Thank you. Councillor Shaw. Hello, Gareth. Councillor Shaw.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I was just going to ask the officers. It seems a fair recommendation on the conservation area panels and so on, but doesn't this already happen in those areas? I have a feeling it probably does, but I don't know. So I don't know if David or Alex would like to confirm what that process is.
I wasn't sure if we were allowed to come back actually, but clearly, obviously,
Yeah,
there
are allowed.
are pre-application discussions and with residents groups. That also includes obviously engagement with conservation area panels. Now, just to recap, we have only recently just formed our new design review panel, and the intention obviously is for schemes to be seen more than once through the process, and there will be more to follow on that. You know, in the next few weeks, as we set that up formally, but you know, the intention is obviously to see it at different stages through the process. Obviously, you know, that's the sort of standard practice in terms of how these design panels work. You know, and so I just wanted to mention that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. So we'll put a recommendation for that to happen, basically, and but it's good that you will be engaging. I appreciate that design review panel is a relatively new part of the process. Thank you. Okay, so whilst I formulate those in English, can we now move on to the second part of the meeting? The decision-making side on the councillor side, i.e. the planning committee members. I'm being very specific about the planning committee members rather than the councillors generally, just because otherwise the conversation can go on forever. Okay, if we can invite one of our guest speakers. Councillor James Husband is the chairman of the planning committee at the Royal Borough of Kensington Chelsea. Hello, James.
Yes, hi.
If you wish to start.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for inviting me. I've just got a few fairly quick remarks, and then obviously delighted to assist with comments and questions. I think the first thing to say, just very quickly about Kensington Chelsea, is that 70% of the borough is actually a conservation area of one sort or another. And we have a very extensive network of traditional amenity societies, residents associations. So it means that the whole planning process and public realm in a wider sense are very much things that huge numbers of residents are interested in. So planning is a really important matter. I followed with interest the earlier discussion, and we've been having a look at a lot of these issues ourselves in the last year or two. First of all, pre-application advice and also planning performance agreements. We've actually had a scheme from 2013 for both of these things. Pre-app, of course, can apply to anybody, including somebody interested in converting a loft. But planning performance agreements apply to the majority of major developments, and they are agreements where a large developer will go to the planning department right at the beginning of the process, and they will agree a set of milestones and also fees as to how they see their application progressing through the system. And I think this is actually quite an important part of the way the process works. Planning performance agreements are subject to FOI. So if I mean, what would happen if somebody asked to see the agreement for a large site? They would get it. A few things, obviously, people's names would be redacted, and one or two things, but essentially that would be available for any major site. I think there are two major challenges to my mind when you're thinking of member involvement here and committees. The first is a more general one that we've already touched on, that to my mind, you have, if you like, you have four separate groups. You have residents, you have councillors, you have planners, planning officers, and then you have applicants. And I think one of the difficulties is that members of the public, and I absolutely recognize, I immediately recognized almost everything that Denise Culver was saying earlier on. One of the problems is that sometimes there's a sense that the planners and the applicants are kind of together, and the councillors and the residents are kind of on the other side. And okay, maybe this is people being polite in Kensington and Chelsea, but some people would say, well, you know, the councillors are decent enough people, but, you know, by comparison with applicants, their advisors, the planning officers, they don't really know very much about it all. And we as residents are kind of all over to one side. And I think that's a kind of perception, which I know a lot of people do feel. And that's an important thing which we have to counteract. The other difficulty, and I think your colleague, I think Councillor Woodruff mentioned this earlier, I think, is that if you're a member of a planning committee, there's this sense that you kind of maybe vaguely know an application is in the air, but then suddenly this great big book arrives about a week before a committee. And it's the first you really know any of the details. Now, that's something which isn't really very satisfactory. And we've been doing a couple of things to try and counteract that. The first is that we have for larger sites, we have a system of members' briefings. Now, the way that they work is that this is before an application is actually put in, that the applicant will present to members of the planning committee, ward councillors, and it's a public meeting, so anybody could come along. And this, if you like, this gives an early sight of what is being discussed. And you know, it's quite useful. I think the other thing which we're actually in the process of developing this, it is called development forums. Now, again, this is for larger sites. A development forum is right back early in the process. It would be after the planning performance agreement had been agreed, but it would still be very early on in the application. And the idea is, again, the applicant would be presenting in a public forum to people what it is that they intend, you know, their current thinking, if you like. Just finally, I'd mention, I think you mentioned a design review panel, which you're in the process of setting up. We have a thing called the Quality Review Panel, which we've just sort of revamped last year. I think that's useful, although the only caveat I would have is there's a danger that you listen to an argument between architects about things. Okay, so you know, you just have to be a little bit careful about how these things are used. But that's also, it's interesting that you obviously officers are thinking along the same lines. The other couple of quick points I'd make is about the timing when things become public. We have, and it's interesting, I think I heard an earlier discussion saying you are about to do this, that our convention is pre-application advice is published when an application is registered. So it means that people can, you know, members of the public can see that. The other issue, which you mentioned in your note to me earlier, is about viability. Now, viability assessments, we publish them along with all of the other documents for an application. And again, we're talking about large applications. And they always feature as part of planning committee reports. I have to say that viability assessments, I mean, obviously you have the benefit of your own, you know, professional planning officers who will know more about this than I do. But if you look at viability, it's governed by sort of national planning guidance, that there's always a bit of a question mark, frankly, about it, because some of the assumptions are ones that in truth we don't actually know the real answer to. I mean, I had a look at, I pulled out this afternoon in preparation the summary of the appraisal for a large scheme on West Cromwell Road. And for example, there's a rate of funding put into that calculation of 6.5%. Now, in truth, we have no idea, nobody has an idea really of actually what the cost of funding really is going to be for this. So viability, it's important and it's useful, but it's detailed, and there are things which inevitably are sort of unknown about it. And I think that is what I mean. I'm very happy to answer questions or take comments, but just a few quick points, really. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just wanted to tell the panel that the reason why I approached Councillor Husband is because Kes and Chelsea were one, if not the first, council to publish pre-app information to the public. So the borough's got experience on how that operates. That's why Councillor Husband was selected. If I may invite I'm not sure how to describe, a small to medium-sized developer, Luke Pullum, who's probably well known to many councillors on the committee who see Luke coming in and speaking as an applicant or on behalf of an applicant. Luke.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I sort of I wouldn't count myself as a developer, but my name's Luke Pullum. I live in Ealing, and I'm the founder of Red and White Architects. I've been asked to contribute to this evening, given our practice submits a significant number of planning applications on behalf of a variety of applicants, from a modest extension up to large residential schemes and placemaking proposals. We've also participated in a number of planning committees over the last 18 years. In terms of the topic, my viewpoint is from the position I like to think of an architect and a resident rather than just the applicant, and therefore a more balanced appraisal. In terms of the local engagement and public consultation, I will say from our experience, this area of the process for all types of application has improved in terms of the community involvement, the connectivity for the majority of people digitally, in conjunction with the array of specialist reports, visualizations with small and major applications. On the smaller minor development schemes we represent, we do engage with the immediate neighbours and the wider context of the neighbourhood via direct meetings and early consultation leaflets. This is now obviously strongly encouraged at the pre-application process. On the larger schemes, we have several consultation days, evenings and meetings with the public, nominated residents, interest groups and councillors, and our proposals are very much shaped to respond to those concerns where this is feasible. And on many schemes of our larger nature, we can demonstrate how this has been adapted. We also obviously work with very specialist consultants on verified views that's been discussed and established accepted methodology. Unlike, may I say, some resident groups that use crude red blocks superimposed on Google Maps, which are completely inaccurate, misleading, and I would say unchallenged. Running obviously in conjunction with the public consultations in many of the schemes, we seek early engagement with the local authority, perhaps before even pen has been put to paper or the site is even owned by the client. This is obviously in the form of pre-application advice, where an applicant will pay significant costs to seek advice and where the officers do their best to provide advice. Obviously, this issue has come up before where it is felt the public should be made aware of this process sooner. However, we do feel the outcome of the advice should remain confidential up until a recommended decision is presented to the committee. At that point, the advice could be made public, but whilst the advice may have assisted in the development of the scheme or not, it is not a document that forms part of the formally submitted application. Therefore, limited weighting for this should be given. I fear if the pre-application advice is made available before an application is even submitted or during the planning process, it will result in less engagement due to the commercial sensitivity nature of the information. And obviously this does not benefit the applicant, the council, local residents, or ultimately the engagement process. Releasing the pre-application advice opens up the intention to challenge matters within it that are likely to be superseded by the final application. But of course, if it's thought useful for planning committee members, it could be made available once an officer's decision has been released. But there is concern of information overload to committee members. And I will say a fine balance has to be struck between development and the public's role in the process. I also think the scale of application has to be carefully considered. We often find smaller developers appear to receive a lot more scrutiny than the larger strategic applications, and think this has to be rebalanced, which we hope, you know, the design review panel and the committee review panel intends to address. I think in terms of the decision making for councillors, this has to be led by the planning officers and their expertise in assessment of application. Obviously, the planning committee are there to rightly question and undertake the various checks and balances against planning policy, where the emphasis on a decision must be based on the planning policy.
Thank you, Luke. And if I may bring in David Scourfield or Alex Jackson to highlight what the council is doing on this topic.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think with regard to planning committee and transparency, there are two aspects to this, and I'll be as brief as I can. There's one, the aspect of governance, that is how the planning committee operates. So there are code of conducts regarding the way councillors conduct themselves in relation to planning applications during the process itself, but also in terms of how they conduct themselves at the planning committee, you know, in terms of their specific roles, the way they engage with officers and members of the public, and indeed in this digital world, the way they may or may not engage with residents through social media throughout that process. And obviously that's something for each councillor to consider. But the focus on this meeting is about planning, and that's the other side of the coin, in that we are part of a process as planning officers that deal with ensuring councillors have as much an idea of the planning system as possible, to give the general background to that, but also as much information on any specific item that's going for planning committee itself. And over the course of the year, we try and run 3 or 4 member training sessions. They generally are a couple of hours long, and the types of information and training that we do relate to that code of conduct and governance. We cover things like section 106 and design. Affordable housing crops up probably once a year, and as I say, the background to the planning system itself. In terms of the officers' report, we try and be as thorough as possible on those, and this brings out some of the themes from the previous discussions. We continue looking at the way we present that information. We hope as professionals that we do take into account all of the relevant considerations. We are there to give a positive recommendation, and by positive I don't necessarily mean an approval. I mean we are there to recommend. In days gone past, some committees operated on the basis that officers would put an and or, i.e. If you want to grant it, these are the conditions, and if you don't, these are the reasons for refusal. That went away some time ago, so we do put positive decisions up in terms of being quite clear to members which which way we think the application could go, but the final say at planning committee certainly is with the members themselves. Viability reports, as the councillor from Ken and Chelsea said, there are aspects of those which are confidential in terms of the market information for definite. We moved to a position, I think it was in early 2019, where we published the viability reports as well. And finally, just on this point, as per Ken and Chelsea, we are moving to a situation where we will publish the pre-application discussions and notes, etc., when a planning application for that particular development has been submitted. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Okay, over to the panel for questions, clarification questions to any of the speakers. Councillor Ball.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think there is a perception issue because of the way that the pre-application process works. That there's a kind of by the time the application comes to committee, there's been so much pre-application discussion between the applicant and the case officer that it's sort of as much the case officer's baby as it is the applicant's baby. And I think it's interesting to hear Councillor Husband actually saying, again, it's similar in KNC, that there is a public perception that the applicants and the council are kind of together on one side, and I think that is something that we do need to be quite careful to try to avoid that perception. So I mean, I guess it's really a question that, you know, does David recognise that perception exists, and what changes can we make? I mean, certainly publicising, making the pre-app information public is helpful, but I'm not sure that totally tackles it. Is there anything else that David could suggest that might help to reduce that perception? You know, that because there's been so much discussion beforehand, the applicant and the council are kind of almost acting as one when they present it. You know, when the case officer presents it to planning, it sort of feels as if they're advocating on behalf of the development. Often.
Before I go to David, if I may, just Councillor Burke, I'll take a few questions, so we'll come back en masse. Councillor Burke.
Okay, just sorry if I've missed this. In terms of the kind of code of conduct and the impartiality, etc., what's the comeback for residents in terms of appeal processes or what have you? Forgive me if I should know this. If they feel within the planning committee stage or in the pre-planning that they weren't given, it didn't feel like a fair process, that it did feel like an advocate type role. Now, I get that could be opening a great big can of worms, but I assume there is a process, but I've had trouble finding it. And I think it's going to be particularly pertinent because obviously all of these now, which is a good thing, are all being recorded. So there's a very clear evidence trail in terms of how conversations take place. And just a quick question, again, forgive me if I should know this, in terms of the actual planning meeting, where the officer, to reinforce John's point, it's perceived as the officer is talking with the developer. Is it an Ealing thing, or is this a legal thing that the residents and the councillors are not given any right to reply? So if, for example, if the officers, you do your little bit at the beginning, then the officers have as long as they want, really. So in my experiences, it's been several hours compared. You don't have any time to come back and say, well, actually, factually, you said that, but that isn't actually right. Is that our choice, or is that the way it has to be? Hope they both made sense. Sorry, they were a little muddled.
Okay, no, thank you. Good questions. Councillor Rooney, are your questions on this similar?
Yes, it's just regarding Code of Conduct.
Okay.
Hi, thank you, Chair. I just have a question about Code of Conduct, and I was just wondering whether there was any scope for councillors to receive to have to do like mandatory training every year, refresher courses on the Code of Conduct when it comes to planning. And I just have a question for Councillor Husband in terms of with Kensington and Chelsea. Do you have to do mandatory training every year, or is it just every 4 years? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rooney. Okay, can we start with David in responding on the perception angle, the process and appeal angle, and the planning committee actual meeting dialogue or lack of dialogue between a comeback by residents and councillors?
Yep, sure. And I'll try and be as brief as I can. In terms of the perception that the pre-application is weighted, I can understand that. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. And I think without going over everything that's been said, the pre-application process is a process whereby the applicant, the developer, comes to the council to test out a particular proposal, and that proposal is discussed and refined. Now, with the bigger developments, we certainly would want to bring the community on board at the earliest opportunity. And I think going back to what Denise was saying about the way in which residents feel that they haven't got enough time, it's not early enough. These are all things that we discuss probably at the first meeting with any particular developer. It's how the developer is going to engage with the community and engage with members to bring them up to speed. So I understand that, and I think that the way around it really is just that continual message that we want to engage people, we want to inform people as members of both planning committee and general ward members. We want to give you the information that you can present to residents as well, because it shouldn't be a case of the perception being that the residents are aligned with councillors and that the officers are aligned with developers. In essence, the difficulty we see for members is that they've got to foot in both camps. They're representing their constituents as elected members, but they're also representing the council as a corporate body, and that includes the governance side and also the local plan side. In terms of code of conduct, the code of conduct is relating to members. It does relate to officers and how they interact. In terms of that redress on impartiality, I think Councillor Burke mentioned, there's no what we call third-party rights of appeal for residents. So once a planning application has been decided, from the point of view of a resident, they can't appeal to the planning inspectorate. The recourse, if a group of residents feel that something is wrong or has gone wrong, is through the court, and that's a judicial review process. The problem with that is it's expensive, and we understand that. So the JR process doesn't come around very often, but it relates to the procedure. It doesn't relate to the decision. It relates to how the council get to that decision and whether or not all its procedures were carried out.
And that includes code of conduct, David, does it?
Sorry?
That includes if you felt they've broken the code of conduct. I'm sure that's very unlikely.
But I think, yeah, it's a difficult one, because if a councillor's broken the code of conduct, then there are two issues there. There's one, whether or not that warrants an investigation by the head of legal. So that's on the governance side, and presumably under legal redress, an aggrieved third party could argue that any breach of the code of conduct could also warrant a JR. So you wouldn't specifically rule that out, but I don't think I've come across it in my experience. And then Councillor Rooney was talking about a mandatory. I don't think it is. I'd need to double check, but we do encourage all members of the planning committee to attend all of the training sessions, and it is open to all members. And indeed, the first things we do at least once a year are code of conduct and the background to the planning system, because not only is it good to give a refresher, but for new councillors coming in, they won't have heard that before. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Before I go to Councillor Husband to respond to the training question, I just want to say, David mentioned about sort of the code of conduct and where individual councillors find themselves possibly, as they call it, in hot water. I remember, I think there was a case in Waltham Forest in 2014 where a councillor who I think, I wasn't quite sure was the chair of the planning committee, but part of the planning committee, and I think there were some legal issues there. I remember that. So, Councillor Husband, do you wish to respond to the training question?
Yes, of course. Yeah, our policy is that we have regular training sessions. They're not mandatory, but they're taken seriously, and I would have thought there would be 2 or 3 per year. Just very quickly, something that was brought up earlier on about are large applications ever recommended for refusal? Certainly in RBKC, what tends to happen is that the officers would say to an applicant, we aren't going to recommend this for permission. Therefore, I certainly in my experience, that's the answer to the question that was posed earlier on. So, but thank you.
Thank you, thank you, Councillor Shaw. You've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Coming from a slightly different angle, and I appreciate Councillor Ball, sort of says that it's almost sort of opposition sides, if you like, are drawn, that there's the planning officers and developers, and then councillors and residents. I do wonder if there could be sort of perceived interest from the other side of councillors sitting on the planning committee on applications within their wards, and that actually, if what Councillor Ball describes is right, then wouldn't those councillors be more prejudiced and be tending to be more on the side of residents? I know a little while ago, I think there were some discussions, within the council of possibly bringing policy forward that exists already in licensing anyway, just to sort of neutralise these effects. The planning policy pool of councillors is quite broad, and whether or not it's worth us sort of putting a recommendation or forward that people shouldn't sit on the planning committee if that application is within their ward. It makes sense if that's, if these are the battle lines that are drawn, which, certainly Councillor Ball seems to have described quite clearly.
Thank you. On that, please, that recommendation, so as you say, sorry, in line with licensing. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just come back on that, because that's not quite what I said. Yeah. So the point that I was making was that there's a resident perception that the applicant and the planning officer are kind of working closely together, and they're on one side. Councillor Husband was saying that that was one side and the councillors and residents were the other side. I wasn't quite positioning where councillors come on that spectrum. I just clarify what I said.
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Ball. Apologies if I've sort of misrepresented you there, but that's been the general feel of the conversation, that's come up. So I just sort of wanted to come across from the other side. That's all. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a good recommendation. If I may jump in and ask a question, actually, of Luke Pullum. You mentioned in your brief that you felt that smaller applications had more scrutiny than the large strategic, some of them, not say strategic, but larger developments generally in principle. If, for example, there was a proposal, say, for example, to have maybe more time and fewer large applications per committee, so it allows the larger ones to be scrutinized more on equal par with small ones. How do you see that being resolved?
Well, it's just, I think, without naming names, we did a case where I was on the committee up first for 2 residential houses, and that was given more preference than a 3,000 home scheme in Southall. That defies logic, and whereas this scheme was given and probably an hour and a half, the 3,000 unit scheme was probably given 15 minutes. So it just felt that we have to deal with the strategic ones. And I think the smaller schemes, quite rightly, still have the scrutiny, but there has to be a balance struck, because, a lot of the smaller schemes, the time that's taken from, the start of a scheme to a decision, is in the months. And I think that has to be addressed at some point. We can consult, we can continue discussing it, we can engage in the process, but the time frame for some of these smaller developments has to be really carefully considered to make otherwise the viability goes. It really does.
Thank you. So possibly in terms of resolving this is to manage the agenda. So first of all, there aren't too many applications that have to be crammed into let's say a 4-hour session, but allow good time for appropriate to the size of the application.
Yeah, I think I think you're I think some of the schemes don't warrant the planning committee. Sometimes I think there is some the focus should be shifted on the amount of objections perhaps, and obviously the size of the development, but it has to be on planning, obviously planning grounds.
No, thank you. No, I'm sure and I'm sure the planning officers can concur that applications we have a policy threshold for applications committee, but also if the planning officer stroke planning chair agree that this is one for due to maybe high level of objection, or a councillor recommends it to bring it to planning committee. So there are different angles. I don't know if David and Alex want to add anything to that. No,
I think what you said was quite correct. Obviously, the scheme of delegation has changed over time, and generally nowadays the items which are referred to planning committee are clearly the larger items and not smaller proposals. So that was all.
Okay, Councillor Taylor.
Will this work this time?
Yes.
Okay. Finally, I've switched different camera and different mic. Okay. I just a number of questions actually. Councillor from KNC mentioned viability assessments. I was just wondering how long the publication of those viability assessments process, how long that's been in place. I know a number of boroughs have started doing that. There was an earlier point I wanted to make about partly members' role and how we support residents. Alex will know, and both David know, in terms of North Acton, we've had a number of volume of applications, and I have said this to the portfolio holder as well. It's just that we'd like support in knowing what comes forward, not just the notification. We get a huge number, and obviously North Acton, there's a lot going on, as you know, and we're just getting inundated. So there's been lots of fatigue around that in recent years. And also just in how you engage planning members maybe in applications, because when I sat on the OPDC planning committee, I remember we would have like sessions to understand early an application. And I know some boroughs, I think Newham might be one of them as well, I think springs to mind. They have these early sessions with members to say, look, this application's come forward, this is what it looks like at the moment, and this is what the consideration is. Is that something, Eileen, I don't know if it does that. It doesn't sound like from what Simon Woodruff was saying earlier, but is that something Ealing could consider?
Okay, before we can give that for response, Councillor Woodruff, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to. The thing about large issues and small issues, I think it's a general thing in politics that you often spend longer thinking about tiny issues that you really have never given much thought to in the beginning, whereas the big issues which you maybe have been thinking for a while, somehow you don't spend so much time talking about. I don't think it's just planning. I think that's a general problem of politics. I'm not surprised at the types of planning as well.
Thank you. Does Councillor Hudson want to come back on the questions from Councillor Taylor?
Yes, just quickly. I think it's the point about applications in your area is an interesting one. I think, I mean, I hasten to add, the RBKC website is a very clunky affair. It's not an advertisement for anything, but I believe within the software, it is possible, if you're a residents association or an individual, that you can see planning applications and licensing applications for your area, as in your, I think it's done by ward. So I think somehow our incredibly hopeless software does seem to be able to make that work. So it may be that it probably isn't that difficult to do if we're able to do it. The other point that I think was mentioned, I think viability, I think we agreed to publish viability assessments when we agreed that pre-app advice would be put up in the public domain. So that's, you know, it's probably, well, it's probably probably 2019, I would guess. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Just before I allow the officers to respond, I am aware, because I work on planning not just in Ealing, but in other boroughs and counties, where I think you all use very similar, as Alex called it, the public access module. I think it just depends if the council purchases various options to allow certain visibility. So I understand Ealing hasn't switched on, nothing modules or purchase them. Alex mentioned the upgrade. If the officers want to respond to any earlier questions.
Yes, thank you. Briefly, Chair. In terms of the pre-application presentation to Planning Committee, it's not something that has operated at Ealing. It's been discussed, and there's no reason why that discussion can't continue. I did operate that scheme at Waltham Forest while I was there, quite successfully. What it obviously does is put pressure on the committee timetable, because if you've got two major pre-apps at 20 minutes or half hour each, that's your first hour done. But it was a good way of getting the scheme before members and out in the public domain. The ICT, as Councillor Husband has said, you know, can range from good to clunky. I don't think I've ever come across very good. It's simply not an issue of money and purchasing. It's about how the system was installed, how the system is maintained by the provider, and how it interfaces with everything else the council's doing. These are old systems. There is a monopoly in the market, and we are now at the point where we are considering what the options are for going forward, whether to stay with our provider or not. And that's just a routine aspect of our work that comes up every couple of years, 2 or 3 years.
Thank you. Are those new hands or old hands? Councillor Woodruff, Councillor Berg, are they old hands? Old for me. Sorry, I'll take it down. Okay. Okay. because it is getting late, I want to, but still give enough time for debate and also for the next section. Has anybody got any issues they'd like to raise? Just to reiterate, recommendations so far for this is that councillors should not sit on the planning committee if there is one in their ward, and one that there should be a time appropriate to the size of development given on planning agendas. Councillor Ball.
Thank you. Yeah. So just in terms of what you said already, yeah. I mean, I don't know what the feeling of everyone is. I'm not totally convinced about not being able to sit on ones in your ward, because apart from anything else, often a member from the ward has more knowledge of the site and background than anyone else does. So I'm not actually convinced that that's a that's necessary. So we may want to vote on that.
We may have to vote on that. Okay.
Excitement. But what I was going to say, I mean, I think the new code of conduct is helpful in terms of prohibiting sort of significant hospitality for committee members. Not that it really happened, but it's a useful thing to have enshrined. But is there something that we want to recommend in terms of other senior councillors who aren't on planning committee? So I'm thinking of MIPIM and so on. Where we have senior councillors go along to things which involve a lot of hospitality, and the events are essentially paid for by developers. So there's a perceptional issue. It's come up in private eye a few times. So should we be going beyond the recent changes to the planning committee to look at non-planning councillors who are effectively receiving hospitality on these things? And the other thing was, I think the suggestion from Councillor Husband, or the practice in RBKC about having these briefings for major applications. I think that's definitely a good thing. The closest we've come to it in Ealing in the past is that when we had planning site visits, we would occasionally, for a major scheme, we would actually sit down and have a bit of a briefing on it at that point. So it's a few days before the committee. I think that's, as far as I can recall, that's the closest we've been to on some of the very larger schemes that happen. But I mean, having it as I think as a standalone session rather than a part of the planning meeting, and having it public so that there's no perception that we're being briefed by the developers in secret. So I think it would be a very helpful thing to have if it was done properly. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ball. Actually, I picked up on that. I think that's where there was a members' briefing, but it was a public meeting where the applicant will present to the ward councillors and to the public. And the same thing. No, I picked up on that. I think that's good. It sounds like a good practice. I think maybe we should have that to maybe omit any perceptions maybe later on down the timeline of applications. Councillor Burke was next.
Yeah, just a couple of things. Just picking up on Sarah's point about the training, the code of conduct training, given that we've been much stronger about equalities training, can we do something, recommend that we mandate, if that's the right word, or something that people do have refresher training and code of conduct training, but something a bit stronger than it is at the moment, where people just do it. It sounds like they can just do it if they want to. I mean, if you're on planning without doing the training, that would worry me. I thought it was mandated. And the second one, sorry, the second one, Joanna, I'm not sure if it's here or in a wash-up one, but was my point earlier, which David responded very positively to, about just greater clarification from the officers where a legitimate planning objection is being overridden. So if the residents put forward that something that is a legitimate thing within the local plan or the London plan, and the officers are saying we're not going to take that into account, that there's greater transparency about why they're not taking that into account in terms of recommending.
Okay, so I can see thank you, Councillor Burke. So a recommendation along the line of if it's not in line with a policy of any description, to be more transparent on the reasons why it's not compliant, or why the council officer, sorry, planning officer, case officer has, I won't say ignored it, but
overridden.
Is not compliant with it. Basically, the decision.
Not just the line I've seen is on the weight of the application. We decided this one didn't really matter. That it needs to be more
transparency on when not compliant with the policy. Okay, I'm trying to keep it as simple. Okay, there's Councillor Woodruff.
I just wanted to, the thing about members voting in their own ward, I think at every meeting, if it involves something in your ward, then then you make it known to everybody else that that's the situation. I think there was a controversial one recently in Councillor Manro's ward on Wood End Library, and I seem to recall he withdrew from the debate and the vote about it, which was the proper thing to do. So I think in reality, I don't think that's been a problem, but I can see that there may be a perception from the outside, and if we think that's more important, then I don't mind going along with it. But I think in reality, I don't think it's been actually a problem.
Well, before I go to Councillor Taylor, object. Is that an old hand?
It's a new one. Sorry.
That's the one. Is on. So it's because I want to ask the panel with regards to what because obviously we have a two sides of the fence here with regards to should ward councillors sit on committee where an application in their ward is being decided. Can Councillor Woodruff and Taylor take their hands off for a moment? If all councillors can just quickly put their hands up, who wants, just to clarify, who wants a recommendation that councillors should not sit on their own planning on their own ward applications? Hands up, those who want to omit councillors sitting on ward applications. Okay, that's two. Okay. So only two panel members want that recommendation. So unfortunately, the majority don't want that. Thank you, Councillor Taylor.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just just to go back to the pre-briefings, as I wasn't sure what John was actually saying, but my thing about those pre-briefings, pre-apps, was obviously not right in immediate advance of a committee, but I'm talking about maybe 6 months before. I think Luke's been talking about a lot of work going well beforehand, months beforehand. I think that's where I was going at. I'm not quite sure why it needs to be public. It could be a presentation from the developer, but the discussion that members would have would be with officers, with the developer not there. I think that's where I was sort of coming from on that one. But also, do back up what Linda was saying on the transparency. You know, I've had applications where the planning committee let me down, especially around the goldsmiths. And so, but you know, the transparency where people have come forward and presented arguments. For example, you know, what's the weight given? Well, the London plan is now official, but what's the what weighting is given to a draft London plan as opposed to our local plan?
Thank you, Councillor Ball. You've come back.
Yeah, just coming back to what Councillor Taylor was saying. I think it's yes. I mean, I mentioned the ones that we had, only a few days before, anecdotally. But yes, I mean, I absolutely agree they should be a long way in advance. But the more substantive thing is, I think it's really important that they are public meetings, because otherwise, the residents' perception would be, here are the councillors meeting in advance to be told how to vote, kind of thing. I mean, obviously that's not what would happen, but that would be the perception. So I think from a transparency and residents' perception point of view, it's really important that those briefings would be public, as they are in Kensington.
Sorry, can I just quickly come back on that, Chair? I understand where you're coming from, but the point was actually when I had the brief before, the developer didn't know the discussion of what's happened with the officers. So if you suddenly make them public and they're broadcast, then everybody knows. And I think that I get your dilemma where you're coming from, and I don't think it's about hiding. It's just trying to understand an application. But I don't think we need, it needs to be broadcast necessarily in those circumstances.
Can I just ask Councillor Husband, these members' briefings, are they pre-submission or post-submission?
They actually can be both. Normally, they would be at a point when a lot of details of the scheme would have been worked up, but the application hadn't actually yet been lodged. Does that make sense?
Just before submission.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, clearly, just quick caveat, obviously, because it's a briefing to people who are sitting on the planning committee, the people who sit on the committee have to be very careful about what they say, because clearly of predetermination and all of these sort of conduct issues that we've touched on. But that's the way our system works.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I think I'm getting the feeling that these briefings are a step forward. However, I think there's a question I think I'd like to ask quickly the panel as part of a recommendation to have such briefings. Should it be public or shouldn't be? So I think we have two sides of the argument here. Can we just quickly have a hands up whether panel members want this sort of briefing to be public or just between developer, case officer and councillors? So hands up if you want it public. Okay, so that's 3 wanting a public. So can I presume that the others don't want to have public? Thank you. So I would draft a recommendation that such meetings should occur, but not in public. I'm sure.
Chair, are you sure there aren't just some of the councillors momentarily didn't spot the vote, haven't they?
Well, I'm hoping they will shout. I'm hoping they will shout at me.
When's a recount?
I want a recount. I can have a recount. No. Okay. Can all councillors hear me? I mean, that's the question. Obviously, if you can't hear me, then you can't hear me. That's the thing. So the irony of it. Okay, I'll ask the question again for the benefit for everybody and the public. Those who would like these members' briefings, I mean, that's a recommendation as a basic, but to make them public. Do we want these meetings to be public? Not necessarily involving the public, but the meeting to be in public. Councillor Mann is waving at me.
Isn't just one thing to resolve is that the officers need to go back and actually, are they practical to have them first of all? That's what we need to consider. No, I mean, we've got to the next stage before we've got to the first stage.
No, I appreciate that, but a recommendation that has to be worked out and put forward in order to analyse, what's and practicalities. We haven't got, 10-hour workshop. So Councillor Mann was waving at me.
I think Councillor Mann was voting.
Yes, I know, but I wasn't quite sure whether it was a physical hand waving at me.
Could I come back, Chair, on the resource aspect?
No, I go on. I appreciate there is a implication.
Yeah, that's one of the aspects, and I mentioned it's worked well as part of planning committee on a managed basis, because that's an actual sort of forum where these types of applications are considered in public. But also, we've been discussing transparency and public involvement, and I'm sure Denise and others are listening in at the fact that if these types of meetings are going to be had, the recommendation wouldn't be to have them in public, and I think that's a sort of a conflict there with the whole way this meeting's being focused on increasing transparency.
I totally understand. But it's about, I suppose, giving. I mean, this is a democracy, so I'm giving the panel members a vote whether we want this in public. Okay, with that in mind and the theme of tonight's session, I appreciate it's late and we just have one more item to cover. Those hands up, those who wish to have this in public. So Councillor Ball, Councillor Burke, Councillor Shaw. Who else there? Is Councillor Nagpal there? Councillor Mann and Councillor Woodruff. So I have to scroll down. Okay.
Councillor Mann put his physical hand up, didn't he? So that was 4. That's 4, including Councillor Mann, because he was sticking his physical hand up.
I personally want in public. So that's 1, 2. Yeah, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, five councillors. And how many are there on the committee? Can Harjeet tell me how much there are on the committee? 1, 2.
I mean, there's 9 here at the moment, so that's
okay.
Majority, including your chair.
Okay, so I'll take that as the majority in public. Okay, thank you. So just to reiterate, recommendation is to have members' briefings held in public on large applications at around a time pre-submission. A recommendation that the planning agenda appropriate time is given to the strategic and the size of the development, so that we don't have, say, for example, 4 heavy applications in one evening, and to give time. There are 2 other recommendations on this line. Was to make training mandatory, if the panel members agree to that, and also to be more transparent. Case officers should be more transparent where an application, which is in the officer report, to provide transparency on where the application is not compliant with policy. Do any panel members disagree with them? Please put your hand up. Councillor Burke. Is that an old hand?
Old hand, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. If no one has an issue with them, I will note them and move forward to the last item. I appreciate it's really getting late, but I want to give good time to the next one. Thank you, and thank you to the speakers. Broadway Living. Broadway Living. This is to analyse and assess the relationship between the council-owned developer and its relationship with the council as a local planning authority. Can David briefly just present how you have set up your relationship with Broadway Living? Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to lead off, Councillor, by saying that the regulations allow councils to submit planning applications to the planning service and for the council through officers delegated or the planning committee to decide those planning applications, Reg 3 of the planning application procedure. And indeed, we get applications from a range of council services, leisure, housing needs, repairs, adaptations, library services, and not forgetting the schools applications. So Broadway Living needs to be seen within that particular context. It's not an anomaly in any way, shape or form. And it should be noted that I guess the way myself and Alex and the team approach these internal applicants is in no way different from the way we approach the external applicants, particularly on the pre-application process. They have to comply with the same policies, they pay the same fees, and they certainly pay the same formal pre-application fees. And we give no leeway or concession planning policy at all to the internal applicants. And indeed, we actually stress that the application should be exemplary in relation to both the planning details and indeed the engagement process. On top of that, members will be aware, members of the planning committee at least, that the larger schemes are also considered by the Mayor of London and or the Secretary of State. So that brings an added layer of scrutiny there. So you know, we can respond to the Q&A and discussion on that, but that's broadly the background to how we treat these. Thank you.
Thank you, David. If I may welcome our speaker for the last item, Mr. Will French. He's the chair of Save Ealing Centre. Will, do you want to put your presentation up,
yes,
or
please.
shall I?
Where are we? Can you see it there?
Yeah.
It should be up there.
Put it in the slideshow mode, yes.
Yeah, no, I'm doing that. Okay. Yeah, so thank you very much. It's been really interesting hearing the conversation this evening. I have found it interesting. I'm a little bit different, I think, what I'm going to say, maybe a bit off where we've been before tonight, but it also picks up quite a number of the issues. But it's a really good time to be discussing this topic on transparency in planning, because with Broadway Living coming up, I think there are a lot of issues. And I wanted to start by picking up some of the points Transparency International say in their report, which you've quoted in the officer report this evening. And just a few of them. The first one is unminuted closed-door meetings undoubtedly undermine confidence in the planning process. Too many local authorities have weak rules to stop this happening, and even fewer councils have control measures for major conflicts of interest. It seems to me, from what I understand of Broadway Living, this may be a risk that we be facing here. I've got my information from two business plans that I've been looking at recently. That's the Broadway Living business plan, which went to Cabinet, I think, on Tuesday, and the Broadway Living's the register provider plan that went last November, I think, and it's got a lot of information about the way those two organizations are going to be working. Now, you may already know this, I didn't, and I don't think many people in the public do, but it was quite an eye-opener when I went through it. It appears Broadway Living will be and I may have got some of this wrong, and if I have got it wrong, please correct me. It's just what I've tried to glean when I've been through the report. And it transpires that Broadway Living is a £500 million company. That's £500 million. 400 million of that is going to be raised in loans secured against the borough. And it's an arm's length company from the council with 32 employees. The chief executive will represent the borough on the board as the main shareholder, representing Ealing. There are going to be annual reports to Cabinet and full council, and there will be a 3-person subcommittee made up of Councillors Bell, Mahfouz and Saviours to approve the individual schemes, their funding and their land disposals. And Broadway Living has got an ambitious programme. It's going to be coming to a site near you, as the map suggests. There are 18 sites now that would hope to produce 1,471 homes, with further sites for around 6,000 homes, including two local authority schools and a third school. So it's going to be a big business. And the relationship there, when you look at the way it's structured, is quite interesting. It's a cozy relationship, in my view. The council will be providing Broadway Living with finance, human resources and IT. Broadway Living in return will then provide their subsidiary Broadway Living, the register provider with development and development advice and development management and development services. And in turn, Broadway Living will also be providing development management services back to the council. So there's a cozy relationship A lot of the exact ways it's going to work were not clear to me at all when I went through the business plan. But what was clear to me is through Broadway Living, the council is a shareholder, landowner, funder of a lot of houses that are going to be built under the plan. And it's a risk-based enterprise. It's going to take calculated risks to improve outcomes. These are all quotes from the business plan. I probably won't bother reading them all through. But you, I'm sorry?
And just to give you a heads up, the governance of Broadway Living will be discussed at a future scrutiny. Can we sort of limit it to sort of the planning relationship?
Right, okay. I do want to skate round it just a bit, if I may, because I think it's important to understand the context, but I take your point. But if I can just say from that slide, it is clearly a risk-based enterprise, and it is set up to take risks, and it will be that sort of organisation, which is quite different from what the council is. I'll leave it there if you want. And it's being the size that it is, £500 million, I do think there's a big risk that the Broadway Living tail will start wagging the Ealing Council dog. It's so big, it's going to dominate much of what goes on in the council. And I wanted then just to have a look at what I'm calling the planning game here, because I think that's also important considering that Broadway Living is going to be a major developer. And I think we've got to reflect that property development, especially in London, is something that made few people very rich. It's dominated by players who are expert in extracting the maximum value from sites. But we also must recognise that whatever the benefits, most developments create external costs to the wider community. The bigger the development, the bigger those costs are. And that's not a criticism of them, that's a fact of life. And that's why we have a planning system. The planning system's there to regulate things and safeguard the public interest to make sure that the developments work, and work not just for the developer, but for the public too. And those interests are what are set down, in fact, the local plan and the London plan. And that is the name of the regulatory game that we have. So under the planning system we have, development control is supposed to regulate development according to our plans. Planning authorities should safeguard public interest and secure public benefit. And skilled developers game that system, and they aim to maximize their returns. Often they win, but things go wrong. But I think much of planning is a game between the developer seeking to maximize their returns against the planning authority, which is seeking to be there on behalf of the wider public and to seek and make sure that it fits in. And as I say, it's a game. And as Transparency International say, it's important that the players are seen to stick to the rules. Now, my question I want to pose tonight is, how will that game be played here in Ealing? And remember, we've got the council, as the London Borough of Ealing, as the developer that's going to seek to extract maximum value from its sites. That's what it will do as a developer, and a profit maximising developer, which it talks about in the business plan. Now, I was alarmed to see that Broadway Living Registered Providers Business Plan says that planning is one of its biggest risks, and that the mitigation of that risk will be by close working with the planning department. So it seems to me there's issues there of contact which I don't understand, are not clear. Now, LBE as the planning authority must at the same time safeguard the public interest. They need to base their decisions on the local plan, the way it's performing. They're there to represent the public. So the question I want to ask tonight, and I hope we'll get an answer, is who is the referee in this game? How's the public interest going to be decided when we've got the same organisation, which is the London Borough of Ealing, both trying to maximise value and also safeguard the public interest? And it's this issue of being transparent and open about it that I think is important. I would also say we're handicapped in Ealing at the moment because the local plan we had is already a very long time out of date, so that what is normally regarded as being representing the public interest is now so far out of date, there's no reference to go back to and look at. Now, I think that's particularly important, not just because of the individual projects that Broadway Living are going to be involved with, but because the scale of Broadway Living's ambitions make it one of Ealing's major developers. Now, I promised I wouldn't talk about individual developments, and I'm not going to tonight. But what I do want to say is some of its developments are so large that they won't just affect the site that they're standing on themselves. They're going to affect large areas because they're so big, they're going to create precedents that other schemes will want to follow. So I came up with some thoughts and ideas about how to make the system at least a little more transparent than I fear it's going to be at the moment. And I think it actually picks up some of the discussions I've been listening to earlier on. And the first one is how the whole pre-application discussion and establishing where the public interest lies is important. And I think that the first question I've got, at what point should the existence of this discussion come into the public domain? And at what point should the public actually have a proper opportunity to talk and to express its view? Now, in previous times, the public was often informed the site was in play through site briefs and action area plans on which the public was consulted. These have lapsed. And for the larger sites, I think that reviving that as a practice would be a good way to keep the public informed and to keep the process being one that's developed with everybody and not sprung on the communities at the last moment when all the public can do is object. And that's too often what happens. Now, the other point I want to make now is Ealing's local plan review is serious. Ealing's local plan is serious out of date. And as far as I can see, work on reviewing it seems to have stalled. I think it's absolutely essential, and I really want to make a strong point about this, that it's got to be restarted in order for the local authority, the planning authority, to discuss and decide and clarify what policies it considers apply generally across the borough are in the public interest. We don't have that now, and that needs to come in. I want to talk about member engagement and the pre-planning application process. This is something that was picked up in the Transparency International report. Generally, I think it's particularly important here. Broadway Living projects are overseen by the three, these are the individual projects, by the three most senior cabinet members, including the leader of the portfolio holder for planning and of course the council leader. So what safeguards will there be to ensure that the council as the planning authority is given due weight? And I think we need to really address that and understand how that's going to be done. Now, the point is the council as a council is inevitably going to be concerned about Broadway Living's financial outcomes. These companies haven't always been successful. A number of them have gone wrong. So it's important that if it starts going wrong in Ealing, this isn't resolved by just trying to push more development through than is appropriate, simply to make the development seem more financially viable than it really ought to be. Sorry, I want to go on, I'm going the wrong way now. Number 3 is actually the relationships with planning officers, giving pre-application advice. And I think the first thing I want to say is the chief executive represents the borough on Broadway Living. Now, if the enterprise should run into difficulties, his neck's going to be on the line. So what I want to know is what safeguards exist to make sure he isn't encouraged to bend planning policies to make schemes more profitable as a way of safeguarding a scheme if it starts to go wrong. Now, I want to come back to what it says in BLRP's business plan, which says that planning is one of Broadway Living's biggest risks that will be mitigated by close working with the planning department. And my final point then is we need to establish exactly what that close working relationship would be, how that would work. And to their saying, it's absolutely essential that all the discussions, the meetings that there are, the pre-application advice and reports that are given, that must be brought out into the public domain so it's transparent. And I think that was what I thought was the purpose of tonight's meeting. So I think that's the end of my little speech, and I want to thank you for letting me make it.
Thank you. If you can, thank you. Okay, let's change the view. Gallery view. Okay, to the panel. If you have any questions for clarification from the officers or from Will French, hands up. Councillor Burke.
So following on from what Will said, and in the context of the earlier discussion of concerns about transparency, etc., really, David, your point is well made about schools, etc., and I think it is, but there is something about size and scale and the amount of money, etc., involved in these. Really, it's how do you think that we could improve the transparency so that the public has confidence in the things that you're saying, and secondly, that expression, where you've got a very clear dividing wall between the purchaser side of it and the scrutiny side of it is made much clearer. I think those two things, how could we improve on that, and how could we communicate that much better?
Thank you. And Councillor Ball.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to this is yes from what's been said earlier, but I just wanted to make sure. Will the publication of pre-op advice that we've talked about apply just as much to Broadway Living as it does to any external applicant? And will there be any other meetings between planning officers and Broadway Living staff which aren't covered by that? I mean, I think on the broader point, it's and this is really difficult. It's very rare for planning committee to reject a kind of an internal application, even if it's a really small one, like a primary school or something. So I take Will's points very seriously, that it will be very difficult for planning committee councillors to act in a quasi-judicial role while in the back of their head they have the financial and political importance of Broadway Living succeeding. So I think there's a really difficult problem here, and it's a lot harder to see what the solution is. But it's certainly, it's certainly a really genuine problem, and I welcome Will's presentation on it, because he raises an extremely good point.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief yet again. It's interesting that, having said the process is broken, that no solution for another body, thankfully, was proposed, because we're in the planning white paper trying to push back at the government's proposals to take away democracy from local areas. So I'm glad the recommendation in Mr. French's presentation wasn't actually to create another body, because I think it's right, and no doubt members will think it's right, that the council retains its power to determine these planning applications. In terms of Broadway Living, obviously Broadway Living aren't represented at this meeting, so I can't talk for them, and nor would I want to, because they are a separate part of the council. And as I explained, we treat them in the same way we treat not only other council teams that are putting in applications, but also external developers. I'm not sure why Broadway Living is being singled out for particular attention within that context. However, what I would say is that the terms that have been used in terms of maximum value and profit, I'm sure I saw on one of the slides that Broadway Living is a non-profit organisation. So the value is the value to the council or to the organisation itself of delivering affordable housing. And I believe that figure is somewhere in the region of 7,500 homes. So that's the overall remit for that. How councillors then weigh up that against the planning issues is obviously something that they've got to consider themselves. But in all our training, we recommend and we enforce that they cannot take on board any issues that relate to the government or the organisation of BL. It's all about the planning side. And in terms of increasing the transparency, yes, I think Councillor Ball was asking the pre-application process and transparency will apply equally to BL and to our other council teams. And without wishing to go back on the discussions we've had with transparency in the pre-app process, we will ensure and endeavour to do as much as possible to make the information available to local people. And just on one final point, the local plan itself, we are still working on that. It hasn't stalled by any means, and I'm sure Mr. French can get an update from Mr. Barton, who's the head of the policy side. And as part of the portfolio plans that we use to recommend to planning committee, the London plan is an important one of those, and obviously that's not out of date. That's going to be signed off within the next few months.
Thank you, David. Councillor Shaw was next.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think David has actually just covered a lot of points I was going to make, that I'm not sure if it's actually within the scope of this committee at the moment, and especially at this late hour, to go into what's really the sort of business details of Broadway living. But suffice to say, you know, it has been discussed elsewhere. I'm sure it will come back and be examined by Overview and Scrutiny Committee and so on. It could be looked at another Scrutiny Committee meeting. But, you know, what the council's trying to do with Broadway living is build houses. As David quite rightly said, it's not profit maximising at all. That's within its business plan. It's actually zero profit, with any profit that's made being reinvested back into building more houses and providing more houses, particularly, you know, sort of affordable housing for people. So, you know, everything that was said previously about the system, yes, that is the planning system. It will have to go through, as David rightly said, all those same checks. So the planning committee will still have to make decisions on any major or large development and so on in exactly the same way that it would be. It's a legal requirement. So, you know, I think we're not really helping anyone by carrying on this debate now.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor.
Yeah, Chair, I was probably the council who actually originally set up Broadway Living, but not in its current guise. And we set up in 2014 with the intention to deliver affordable housing. You know, this is a political critique. This is not about the transparency element of planning. And I echo what Gareth Shaw's just said. Actually, if that debate is happening somewhere else, fine, take it somewhere else. But this, you know, David Schofield's pointed out the importance of how it's treated, and that's what we need to focus on in terms of their application.
Thank you. Before I go to Councillor Woodruff, I just wanted to make a point where I don't necessarily want to make this political. This is the whole point of this evening is about transparency. And a couple of councillors said, well, how do we improve the transparency in this aspect to reduce the perception that may be conceived as a result of the council owning Broadway Living? So I think the thought is, how do we improve on that? Councillor Woodruff.
Yeah, thank you. I think, for the risk of repeating what my colleagues have said, the new Broadway Living is a brand new organisation. I know that it's had a previous guise, but this is a new. I mean, the council is back in the business of actually building houses, which is the point. And the way Broadway living has been put to me is very different from the way our speaker has said. But I recognise there are issues here. I think Councillor Dubrovsky said another scrutiny committee is looking at Broadway living.
Yes, it'll be in a few months' time. Yeah.
Well, I certainly that's a good thing. I think so. A number of the things that have been said may it's worth taking on board and having a further think about. I would just say that planning committee does not come under the cabinet member for planning. The cabinet member of planning is responsible for planning policy, but no way does the cabinet, no way does the planning committee and the planning officers come under the cabinet member. That's a different system. But I would certainly agree that that should be brought to the other scrutiny committee on Broadway living. But I don't really recognise the reality of what the speaker was saying about Broadway living, and I hope I'm right and he's wrong.
Thank you, Councillor. If I may, before I go to David, if I may, I just want to separate, I'm being really, really careful here, the governance aspect of Broadway living. That's why I was trying to sort of limit the aspect and restrict what we'll be saying in terms of the whole organisation. The governance will be discussed at I think it's the April overview and scrutiny to discuss the governance of arm's length operations like Broadway living and Greener Ealing. Okay, so I'm really trying to separate the governance side and the transparency of the planning process and the council as a local planning authority, not as a council as the owner of Broadway living. David.
Yeah, the word assurance has popped up, and just as I was listening to the debate, it suddenly struck me that the answer to that is actually in the presentation that Mr. French presented, because as highlighted, BL themselves are saying the biggest risk to this development is planning. Isn't that a good thing that BL are saying, actually, we've got no certainty whatsoever on these developments? I would be more inclined to be worried if they had said something like planning wasn't a risk or it was a low risk. It's seen as a high risk. They know it's a high risk because they know we as planning officers do our jobs.
Thank you, David. So because this is a scrutiny panel where there's a debate between the panel members, I don't want to go back and forward after the Q&A. So I just want to put forward to the panel members, because it is getting late and I want to wrap up, but don't want to just cut off, is with what you heard so far from the speakers, from the officers, and amongst yourselves, are there any recommendations that can be put forward? Doesn't have to be plural, it could be just one. And the main issue that councillors have brought up, and I'm not trying to make it political because that's not the theme of this evening, is how can we improve and assure the transparency of the planning process involving Broadway living applications that may come forward. So, Councillor Burke.
So I think there's something here which is about communication. You know, I mean, and it's always very difficult. How much do people read websites and how we communicate? But I mean, David, the way you've described that is really, really clear. And as various panel members, without being political, you know, this is about the business of building houses, blah, blah, blah. But there's something out there about how we actually communicate it. And I think it's not easy because it's a fairly complex idea, but the rationale for it and the pros for it and the assurance, I think, is a brilliant word, David. I actually think that's a brilliant word. If we could actually have something that was reasonably succinct about the assurance on it, that's much more evident on all our websites and what have you, I think that would be really helpful. I don't know if that's a useful recommendation or give somebody a load more work, but I think there is something around assurance.
before I go to Councillor Woodruff, even though I don't know if that's an old hand, I just want to highlight on the previous section we had a recommendation about having a members briefing. I think because the nature of Broadway Living and its owners, so to speak, or shareholders, or stakeholders, is maybe a members briefing in public to reassure and communicate to the public applications as they come in. I'm not sure if panel members, I mean, obviously the recommendation from earlier on will apply to this. So I think it's probably for the officers to make more emphasis in making the information transparent and well communicated, as Councillor Burke highlights. Is there anybody else who wishes to speak? Any further recommendations?
May I just second Councillor Burke's? I think what I'd second Councillor Burke's suggestion that there needs to be clear communication about essentially the message that David has responded with tonight. I think that is something that ought to be out in the public domain more clearly than the recording of the Zoom meeting. I think the public have legitimate concern about this, and I think it's something that it would be helpful to have a response to that's public at this early stage, as well as obviously at later stages having public briefings and so on to keep and I think that's quite a much later stage when specific applications from major applications from Broadway Living as for specific major applications for other providers come forward. We should have public briefings on it. But I think at this stage, if there's just a simple statement of what that relationship is and what it isn't.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Ball. So basically, a clear, other than the earlier recommendations which would fall under this as well, it's about effectively a clear communication statement, and I think transparency of that relationship and the entities on both sides. I mean, I don't think that's extremely resource intensive, but helps in the perception, which was discussed earlier about different entities. So is there any further points by the panel members to raise? I can't see any. So in order to wrap up, I want to wrap up as quickly as possible.
Sorry, just very, very, very briefly, if and fine with the recommendation that you just made for that, but I'm sure around the Broadway Living there will be a communications from the council comms team about that probably encapsulates a lot of what we've already said there. So it might be worth checking that before we make a recommendation that's already been done. That's all.
Thank you, Councillor Shaw. I think, unless I maybe misunderstood panel members, whilst I'm not taking away any press communication, I think it's for the council as a local planning authority. I think in terms of making, I wouldn't say a statement, but a formal transparency, I suppose, summary of its relationship as a local planning authority. We as councillors, we're well versed, but it's the perception for the public. Any council press statement is a council press statement as a Broadway Living, I suppose, not as a planning authority. So I'm just trying to separate the two hats from the Broadway Living and the local planning authority.
I think, Chair, you would really need to, for the sake of fairness, include any council application. It's not, as I say, just about Broadway Living. It's about there is no difference in essence between Broadway Living and our education service. These secondary schools go up that cost several £1 million, if not more than that. In a business sense, they're high value, but they're value in education, just as BL is value in affordable. So yeah, if we're going to do it, I would suggest we do it about how we treat our own applications.
So all council related or council led developments.
Yeah.
I'm happy about that. I don't think any panel member has any issue. Councillor Shaw, is that an old hand?
No, sorry, Chair. I was just again. I'll support David with that, and I think it's worth the panel remembering that it's not so long ago that one of the secondary school applications was actually turned down for lack of community space and community use within it, and had to come back. So that system is in place, as I emphasised earlier. So all those legal requirements will be met.
Thank you. Okay, if just wrapping up the meeting, if I may, just want to do the panel members wish to rehear or re-listen to the recommendations?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, I will clarify. Okay, so for the first of the access to the planning process, in no specific order, for any application that comes forward, is to put forward an executive summary. To a degree that already happens, but with less jargon and more of a fair and neutral wording, so that the public know from the summary what's being proposed. The second recommendation is the council should regularly review and update and facilitate contact with resident associations, old and new, in order to maintain that dialogue for future applications. The third recommendation is to ensure and verify the dates on the portal, on the planning portal. The fourth recommendation is that council seeks, although this might go to Secretary of State as a general policy, to formally state that where developers do consultations, to stress a disclaimer that this is not a council consultation, so that those who wish to partake in the planning process know that their comments to the developer or the applicant will not go to the council as part of the formal consultation process. So that's 4 recommendations on the first section. On the second section, I believe I have 3. One is to formally engage the design review panel in part of its planning consultation process. The second one is to have either on a developer or on the council to have a better neighbouring or neighbour locus notification, but that will need a Secretary of State legislation change. The third one is to have a dialogue between residents, council and the applicant, in order to have that dialogue, to have the best and the needed views, the CGI, the illustrations, available to both the public and to the committee members. So we are furnished with the appropriate images of that application. And the last one we've just discussed, it's to have a clear communication stroke statement on the relationship between the local planning authority and all council-led developments. Do any panel members have any comments on those recommendations, if I have interpreted it incorrectly?
Well, there's just one detail there. It's just on the old residents association. I think there are some residents association that have fallen apart and have ended up as one person and a dog, really. But I don't suppose it matters so much. But I don't know whether somebody's looking into whether all resident associations are still active as such.
I think that, thank you. I think that was part of the recommendation, where it should be a regular review, say, for example, an annual review, just to make contact with those associations are still live, and to maybe capture new ones. It can be advertising that in around Ealing, for example, where every householder gets it. So I think that's a good way of picking up new ones, even in small pockets. It doesn't have to be a bigger association. It could be a small cul-de-sac. So I think Councillor Woodruff, that I think would encapsulate, hopefully, any dormant ones, or those who have, as you say, one man and dog. Any other panel member have any comments?
Just Chair, just on the executive briefing, yeah, because I did say to make it fair and balanced and neutral, because obviously I think the first thing people tend to look for is how many units are housed and how tall the building's going to be. But there will be benefits in terms of, you know, proposals in an application if it's low car usage or car free, you know, what is, you know, some other benefits. So I think it might be bullet points, you know, but see, everybody looks for the instant number of units of housing and how tall it tends to be. But, you know, but a summary, you know, should put in all those as much details as possible.
Thank you. So you basically want the vital statistics, which actually, I mean, I personally always ask our planning committees about the housing matrix, about the rooms and the sizes. So basically a high level summary of the statistic, like you say, number of units, amenity space.
Yeah, I mean, just to give an example, it's not about housing. There is one which I don't think Ealing is considered, but it's in the OPDC area. There was proposed for a data centre, which has nothing to do with housing, but it might be a number of jobs, for example, that have been proposed as part of that, which is not necessarily planning consideration itself. But you know, there are a number of criteria to an application, you know. So, but I'll leave that to the office.
Thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you for sort of beefing that up. Thank you. Other panel members have any questions on those recommendations? So I'd like to wrap up the meeting. Thank you. Thank you very much. If I may say thank you to the speakers this evening as well, and the officers. I may thank you for your time. I'm sorry it's gone late, but I think the discussion has been, I think, fruitful in many ways, and I'm hoping maybe, you know, it'll improve the transparency of the planning process for all. I think it's finding that balance. So thank you very much. And panel members, if we can finish off the agenda in terms of the panel work programme. Does anybody have any issues on that? The next meeting is going to be, which I think is going to be in April. It's about the public engagement of council meetings, and consider the effectiveness of public engagement for council meetings and make recommendations accordingly. So please bear that in mind. And just want to thank Haji Baines, our clerk, and all the panel members for attending this evening. Thank you very much and have a good night.